It was a warm summer night, and we were cruising down one of those lonely country roads outside of town. The kind where the trees press in close on both sides and the moonlight barely filters through. Chester was at the wheel, and I was in the passenger seat, both of us feeling pretty pleased with ourselves for sneaking out. We'd been driving for maybe an hour, talking and laughing, when Chester suddenly slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, and I was thrown forward, nearly hitting my head on the dashboard. "What the hell, Chester?" I yelled, heart racing from the sudden stop. But Chester didn't answer. He was staring straight ahead, eyes wide, face pale as a sheet in the dim light. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the middle of the road, not 20 feet in front of us, was something. At first, my mind couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was tall, much taller than any man I'd ever seen, maybe 7, even 8 feet high, and it was just standing there, perfectly still, staring right at us. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I started to make out more details. It was covered in what looked like thick, matted fur, a deep, dark brown color. Its arms were impossibly long, hanging down almost to its knees, but it was standing upright, on 2 legs, like a man. The face. God, I'll never forget that face as long as I live. It was almost human, but wrong. The brow was heavy, sloping, with deep-set eyes that glinted in the car's headlights. The nose was flat and wide, and the mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that seemed too big, too sharp. For what felt like an eternity, we all just stayed frozen like that. Us in the car, hearts pounding so loud I swear you could hear them over the engine's idle. And that thing just standing there, watching us. Then, slowly, it started to move. One massive foot lifted and came down with a heavy thud on the dirt road. Then another step. It was coming towards us. Chester and I both seemed to unfreeze at the same moment. He fumbled with the gear shift, trying to get the car into reverse. I reached for the door handle, some insane part of my brain thinking I might be able to outrun this thing if I had to. That's when it let out a sound that I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't a roar, not exactly. It was more like a scream, high-pitched and piercing, but with a deep, guttural undertone that you could feel in your bones. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world. Chester finally got the car into gear and stomped on the gas. The tires spun in the loose dirt for a heart-stopping moment before finding purchase. We shot backwards down the road, the creature's massive form quickly swallowed up by the darkness ahead of us. We didn't stop. We didn't even slow down until we hit the main road back into town. We were both shaking, gasping for breath like we'd run a mile. Chester pulled over to the side of the road, and we just sat there for a while, trying to process what we'd seen. What was that thing?" Chester finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "I don't know. I can't." We drove back to town in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. When we got back, we swore to each other that we wouldn't tell anyone what we'd seen. Who would believe us anyway? But I couldn't shake the memory of that night. For weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature's face, heard that bone-chilling scream. I kept expecting to see it again, lurking in the shadows or standing at the edge of town. But it never appeared. As the years went by, I tried to convince myself that it had been some kind of shared hallucination. Maybe we'd both fallen asleep at the wheel and had the same nightmare. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. Chester and I never spoke about it again, not really. Sometimes, when we'd get together for a drink, there'd be a moment, a shared look, a hesitation, where I knew we were both thinking about that night. But we never put it into words. Now, all these years later, I still don't know what to make of what we saw. Was it some kind of undiscovered animal, a monster from an old legend come to life, or something else entirely? I've heard stories since then, whispers of similar sightings in other parts of the country. They call it Bigfoot now, I think, but none of those stories quite match what Chester and I saw that night. I'm an old man now, and Chester's been gone for years. I've never told anyone else this story. Who'd believe the ramblings of an old-timer anyway? But I know what I saw, and sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind rustles through the trees just right, I swear I can still hear that unearthly scream echoing in the distance. I don't go out driving at night anymore, and I always make sure my doors are locked tight, because even after all these years, a part of me is still that terrified teenager, staring into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist, something that defies explanation. And I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the dark woods beyond the edge of town, that creature is still out there, waiting, watching. Maybe it's best if some mysteries remain unsolved, but I know what I saw that night in El Dorado, and I'll carry that memory with me to my grave. Story 2. I was just 15 years old when it happened, but the memory of that day in Bradford still chills me to the bone, even now, over 60 years later. It was the summer of 1963, and my best friend Tom and I were out playing ball near the creek, like we often did on warm afternoons after school. We had found a nice flat area by the water where we could toss the baseball back and forth without it rolling away. As we were playing catch, I remember hearing an odd splashing sound coming from further down the creek. At first, I didn't think much of it, probably just a deer or something coming to get a drink. But then I saw Tom freeze mid-throw, his eyes going wide as he stared at something behind me. "What is it?" I asked, turning to follow his gaze. That's when I saw it too, and felt my blood run cold. Standing in the shallow water of the creek about 50 yards away was the tallest, strangest-looking creature I had ever seen. It must have been at least 8 feet tall, with long, gangly arms that hung down past its knees. The thing was covered in dark, matted fur and had a vaguely ape-like face, but there was something deeply unsettling and unnatural about its proportions and the way it moved. For a moment we all just stood there frozen, Tom and I staring in disbelief, and this thing staring right back at us with an unblinking gaze. Then it took a halting step in our direction, its freakishly long arms swinging at its sides, and that's when the spell broke. Tom and I both let out terrified yells and took off running as fast as we could back towards town. I glanced back over my shoulder as we ran and nearly tripped over my own feet when I saw the creature pursuing us at an unbelievable speed. Its gait was awkward and loping, but it was covering ground incredibly quickly with those impossibly long strides. I could hear it splashing through the creek behind us, getting closer by the second. "Run faster!" I screamed to Tom, my heart pounding in my chest. We sprinted across the grassy field, our feet pounding against the earth. I could hear the heavy footfalls of the creature gaining on us, accompanied by a deep, guttural, panting sound that sent shivers down my spine. Just as I thought it was about to overtake us, we burst out of the tree line and onto the road leading back into town. Whether it was the sight of the road or just dumb luck, the creature suddenly veered off and disappeared back into the woods with a final blood-curdling howl that echoed through the trees. Tom and I didn't stop running until we reached his house, slamming the door behind us and collapsing onto the floor in exhaustion and terror. Tom's dad found us there a few minutes later, pale and shaking and barely able to catch our breath. "What in God's name happened to you boys?" he demanded, clearly alarmed by our state. Between gasping breaths, we managed to stammer out what we had seen. The huge, furry creature by the creek, how it had chased us, the inhuman speed, and those horrifying long arms. Tom's dad listened with growing concern, his brow furrowed. "Are you sure it wasn't just a bear?" he asked skeptically. "Or maybe someone in a costume playing a prank?" But we were adamant about what we had seen. This was no bear, and definitely not a person in a costume. The way it moved was just wrong, unnatural. Tom's dad must have seen the genuine fear in our eyes because his expression grew grave. "All right, boys, you stay here. I'm going to go check it out," he said, grabbing his hunting rifle from the closet. "No, don't," Tom cried out, grabbing his dad's arm. "It's too dangerous." But Tom's dad gently shook him off. "Don't worry, I'll be careful. But if there really is some kind of dangerous animal out there, we need to know about it." We begged him not to go, but he was determined. He headed out to his truck, rifle in hand, and drove off towards the creek where we had encountered the creature. Tom and I huddled anxiously by the window, scanning the road for any sign of his return. After what felt like hours, but was probably only about 45 minutes, we finally saw the headlights of Tom's dad's truck coming back down the road. We rushed outside to meet him as he pulled up. "Did you see it? Did you find anything?" we asked eagerly as he got out of the truck. Tom's dad shook his head, looking perplexed. "I drove all around that area and walked along the creek for a ways. Didn't see any sign of your creature, or any kind of large animal for that matter. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing." We were stunned. How could there be no trace of that massive thing that had chased us? But it was huge, and so fast," I stammered. "How could it just disappear without a trace?" Tom's dad put a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Look, I believe that you boys saw something that scared you, but sometimes our eyes can play tricks on us, especially when we're startled. Maybe it was just a deer, or even a large dog that looked bigger than it was in the moment." But Tom and I knew what we had seen. No deer or dog could move the way that thing did, or have those impossibly long arms. We tried to protest, but Tom's dad gently shut us down. "I think you boys have had enough excitement for one day. Why don't you come inside and I'll fix us all some dinner? You can stay the night if you want," he offered, guiding us back towards the house. As we walked inside, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I knew that what we had seen was real, no matter what the adults tried to tell us. That night, and for many nights after, I had vivid nightmares of those long, grasping arms reaching for me in the dark. In the days and weeks that followed, Tom and I tried to tell others about what we had encountered, but no one really believed us. A few other kids from school went to check out the area by the creek, but of course they found nothing. Eventually, people stopped listening to our story altogether and wrote it off as an overactive imagination or a bid for attention. But Tom and I knew the truth. We had seen something that day, something that shouldn't exist in our world. The memory of those unblinking eyes and that inhuman loping gait still haunts me to this day. I've spent countless hours over the years researching similar sightings and creatures, trying to make sense of what we encountered. While I've never found a perfect match, I've come across enough stories of Sasquatch and other mysterious bipedal creatures to know that we're not alone in our experience. To this day, I still can't explain what exactly we saw that summer afternoon in Bradford. Was it some unknown species of primate, an interdimensional being, a government experiment gone wrong? I may never know for sure. But one thing I do know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows, just out of sight. I'm an old man now, but I've never forgotten that day. Sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I still find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that towering figure emerge once again. The encounter changed me forever, opening my eyes to a hidden world of mystery and danger that most people never glimpse. So if you're ever out in the wilds of Pennsylvania and you hear an odd splashing in a nearby creek, or catch a glimpse of something tall and fur-covered out of the corner of your eye, don't disregard it. You might just be face to face with the same inexplicable horror that Tom and I encountered all those years ago. And if you are, I have just one piece of advice. Run. Run as fast as you can and don't look back. You never know what might be gaining on you with those impossibly long strides. Story 3. We hopped the fence around 11 p.m., trying to stifle our giggles as we stripped down to our swimsuits. The water was cool and refreshing as we splashed around under the moonlight. For a while, it was just harmless fun, but then I heard something rustling in the woods beyond the pool fence. At first, I brushed it off as probably just a raccoon or something, but the sounds kept getting louder, like something big was moving through the underbrush. "Hey guys, do you hear that?" I whispered. The others paused their horseplay and listened. "I don't hear anything," Jake said with a shrug. But a moment later, there was an unmistakable crack of a branch snapping. We all froze, suddenly on edge. The cheerful atmosphere evaporated in an instant. I felt my heart start to race as I scanned the tree line, straining to see in the darkness. That's when I saw it, a massive dark shape emerging from the woods. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, and it was covered in thick, matted fur. I let out a strangled yelp and pointed. The others turned to look and immediately started freaking out. Lizzie screamed. We all scrambled out of the pool in a panic. "What the hell is that thing?" Mike shouted as we grabbed our clothes. I couldn't take my eyes off the creature. It was lumbering towards us on 2 legs. Its arms hung down almost to its knees. The head was large and somewhat cone-shaped, sitting directly on broad, sloping shoulders. There was no neck that I could see. As it got closer to the pool area, I could make out more details in the dim light. The face was flat and ape-like, with a heavy brow ridge. But the eyes were terrifyingly human-looking. They seemed to glow slightly in the darkness. We bolted for the fence, not even bothering to put our clothes back on. I've never climbed so fast in my life. We spilled out onto the street and kept running. After a couple blocks, we finally stopped to catch our breath. Everyone was wide-eyed and panting. What the hell was that?" Lizzie gasped out between breaths. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," Jake said. "Let's go to my house. My parents are out of town." We hurried to Jake's place, constantly looking over our shoulders. Once inside, we collapsed in the living room, still dripping wet and shaken. "Okay, let's think about this rationally," Mike said after we'd calmed down a bit. "Maybe it was just a bear or something?" I shook my head vehemently. "No way. That thing was walking on 2 legs, and it was way too tall to be a bear." "Well, what else could it be?" Lizzie asked. "You're not saying it was like Bigfoot or something, are you?" I hesitated. It sounded crazy, but that's exactly what I was thinking. The others must have read it on my face. "Come on, man. Bigfoot isn't real," Jake scoffed. But I could see the doubt in his eyes. We debated back and forth for a while. The others seemed eager to explain it away as anything other than what we'd actually seen. I get it. It's easier to rationalize than accept that everything you thought you knew about the world might be wrong. But I knew what I saw, and I wasn't going to just forget about it. The next day I went back to the pool alone. I had to see if there was any evidence left behind. As I approached the fence, my stomach churned with anxiety. Part of me was terrified I'd encounter the creature again in broad daylight. I hopped the fence and looked around. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. But then I noticed some strange marks on the concrete pool deck. They looked like footprints, but were much larger than a human foot, probably 15 inches long and very wide. My heart started pounding as I examined them closer. They were somewhat smeared, like whatever made them had been dripping wet, but I could make out what looked like toe impressions at the front. I pulled out my phone to take some pictures, my hands shaking slightly. As I was snapping photos, a horrible stench suddenly hit me. It was like a combination of wet dog, rotting meat, and something musky I couldn't identify. I gagged and covered my nose. That's when I heard the rustling in the woods again. Panic seized me and I bolted for the fence, not even looking back. I ran all the way home, my lungs burning. When I got home, I immediately pulled up the photos on my phone, but to my dismay, they were all blurry and indistinct. You could barely make out that there were marks on the concrete at all, let alone any details. I was frustrated, but even more determined to figure out what was going on. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into researching cryptids and Bigfoot sightings. I scoured online forums and message boards, looking for any similar encounters in our area. To my surprise, I found quite a few reports from around Greensboro of a large, hair-covered creature. Most were pretty vague, but a few lined up eerily well with what we'd seen. One report in particular caught my attention. It was from a guy who claimed to have a close encounter while camping in the woods outside of town. He described coming face to face with an 8-foot-tall ape-like creature with glowing eyes. The detail that really got me was that he mentioned a strong, musky odor, just like what I'd smelled at the pool. I tried to tell my friends about what I'd found, but they shut me down. They'd convinced themselves it was just a bear or some other normal animal. Jake even suggested maybe someone was playing a prank on us in a costume, but I knew the truth. What we saw that night was real, and it was still out there somewhere. I became obsessed with trying to spot the creature again. I started spending my evenings staking out the woods near the pool. I'd sit for hours, watching and listening. Most nights, nothing happened, but occasionally I'd hear those telltale rustling sounds or catch a whiff of that distinctive odor. One night, about a month after our first encounter, I finally saw it again. I was sitting in my usual spot at the edge of the woods when I heard heavy footsteps approaching. My heart leapt into my throat as I saw the massive hair-covered form emerge from the trees. It walked on 2 legs to the edge of the pool, its movements surprisingly graceful for such a large creature. In the moonlight, I could see steam rising off its wet fur. Had it been swimming? I watched, barely breathing, as it stood there for several long moments. Then it turned its head and looked directly at me. Those eerily human eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a jolt of recognition. It knew I was there. It had probably known all along. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. I was frozen in place, equal parts terrified and awestruck. I had so many questions I wanted to ask. What was it? Where did it come from? Was it intelligent? But before I could do anything, it turned and loped back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. I sat there for a long time afterward, trying to process what had just happened. That was the last time I saw the creature. I kept up my stakeouts for a while, but it never appeared again. Eventually, I had to accept that it was gone. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened that summer. I've read every book and article I could find on Bigfoot and other cryptids. I've reached out to researchers and self-proclaimed experts, but I'm no closer to understanding what I saw. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the fear I felt that first night, the unmistakable footprints by the pool, the intense gaze of those intelligent eyes. It was real. I know it was. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, my own friends who were there that night don't even believe me anymore. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. Whatever that creature was, it changed my entire worldview. It made me realize that there are things out there we can't explain, things that defy our understanding of reality. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the world is more mysterious and wondrous than we give it credit for. I still go camping in those woods sometimes, and every time I find myself scanning the tree line, hoping for another glimpse of that impossible creature. I don't know if I'll ever see it again, but I'll never stop looking. Story 4. I'll never forget that day in Seign County back in '75. I was just a kid then, visiting my uncle's farm for the summer. It was supposed to be all fun and games, helping out with chores and exploring the countryside. But what happened that afternoon changed everything. It was a hot July day, and Uncle Jim and I had been out in the fields since early morning. By mid-afternoon, we were both drenched in sweat and ready for a break. "Hey, kiddo, want to go check out the creek?" he asked, wiping his brow. I eagerly nodded, anything to get out of the sun for a bit. We made our way through the tall grass towards the wooded area at the edge of the property. The trees provided some welcome shade as we approached the babbling creek. I was about to run ahead when Uncle Jim suddenly grabbed my shoulder, stopping me in my tracks. "Wait," he whispered, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. There, maybe 50 yards away, was the biggest, strangest creature I'd ever laid eyes on. It was standing upright next to a massive oak tree, partially obscured by the branches. But even from that distance I could tell it was enormous, easily over 7 feet tall. My heart started racing as I took in more details. The thing was covered in dark, matted fur from head to toe. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in what looked like huge hands. The head sat directly on broad, sloping shoulders, no neck that I could see. For a few moments I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen, staring at this impossible being. Was I seeing things? Had the heat gotten to me? But one look at my uncle's pale, shocked face told me this was real. The creature hadn't noticed us yet. It seemed to be examining something on the tree trunk, running those massive hands over the bark. Its movements were slow and deliberate, almost gentle despite its intimidating size. I wanted to run, to scream, to do something, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. Uncle Jim's grip on my shoulder tightened. "Don't move," he breathed, barely audible. We stood there for what felt like hours, hardly daring to breathe. The only sounds were the faint rustle of leaves and the pounding of my own heart in my ears. Suddenly, the creature's head snapped up. I'll never forget the moment it turned and looked directly at us. The face was like nothing I'd ever seen, a blend of ape and man, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with intelligence. A chill ran down my spine as those eyes locked onto mine. For a split second, time stood still. Then survival instinct kicked in. "Run!" Uncle Jim yelled, shoving me forward. We took off, sprinting through the trees, crashing through undergrowth in blind panic. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, fueled by pure adrenaline. Branches whipped at my face and I stumbled over roots, but I didn't slow down. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us getting closer. The creature was chasing us. We burst out of the tree line into the open field, still running full tilt towards the farmhouse. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing was right behind us, moving with incredible speed for its size. I caught a glimpse of its face contorted in what looked like a snarl, revealing yellowed teeth. "Don't look back! Just run!" Uncle Jim yelled. I pushed myself harder, lungs burning, legs aching. The house seemed impossibly far away. Just as I thought my legs would give out, we reached the back porch. Uncle Jim practically threw me up the steps, fumbling with his keys. I cowered against the door, certain at any moment I'd feel those massive hands grab me. But when I finally worked up the courage to look, the creature was gone. The field was empty, no sign of the massive being that had been chasing us moments before. It had vanished as suddenly as it appeared. We burst into the house, slamming and locking the door behind us. For several minutes, we just sat there on the floor, gasping for breath. I was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down my face. Uncle Jim looked as scared as I'd ever seen him. What was that thing?" I finally managed to choke out. He shook his head, still trying to catch his breath. "I don't know, kid. I've never seen anything like it in my life." We spent the rest of the day huddled in the house, jumping at every little sound. Uncle Jim called the sheriff, but of course they found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing to prove what we'd seen was real. That night, I lay awake for hours, replaying the encounter in my mind. The creature's face, those intelligent eyes, the way it moved, it all seemed impossible. But I knew what I saw. In the years since, I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate prank. But deep down, I know the truth. There was something out there in those woods that defied explanation. I've never told many people about what happened that day. Who would believe me? But I know Uncle Jim saw it too. Sometimes when we get together, I'll catch him staring off into the distance with a troubled look. I know he's thinking about it too. I'm an adult now, with kids of my own. But I've never forgotten that summer day in Seign County. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, the image of that creature vivid in my mind. I've never gone back to those woods. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, that thing is still roaming free. Story 5. I still can't believe what happened that day. It was the summer of 1980, and my buddy Rick and I had decided to take a fishing trip down to Baxter County, near the Mississippi River. We'd heard the fishing was great there, especially for catfish, so we packed up our gear and headed out early one Saturday morning. The weather was perfect, warm but not too hot, with a light breeze coming off the water. We found a nice secluded spot on the shore of a small lake that fed into the river. It was surrounded by thick forest on all sides, real backwoods country. We set up our chairs and cooler, baited our lines, and settled in for what we hoped would be a relaxing day of fishing and shooting the breeze. For the first few hours, everything was going great. We'd caught a few decent-sized catfish and were just enjoying being out in nature, away from the noise and bustle of everyday life. Rick was in the middle of telling some ridiculous story about his crazy neighbor when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye, across the lake. At first, I thought it was just a deer, or maybe a black bear coming down to the water for a drink. But as I turned to look directly at it, I realized this was something much larger, and it was standing upright. My brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. There, partially obscured by the vegetation at the water's edge, was a massive, dark figure. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall, with a broad, muscular build covered in thick, matted fur. The creature was just standing there, completely still, half hidden behind a cluster of trees and bushes. I went completely rigid, my fishing pole frozen in my hands. "Rick," I whispered urgently, not taking my eyes off the thing. "Rick, look across the lake. Tell me you see that." Rick must have heard the fear in my voice because he stopped mid-sentence and slowly turned to look where I was staring. I heard his sharp intake of breath when he spotted it too. "What the hell is that?" he hissed. I shook my head slightly, unable to form words. My mind was racing, trying to come up with some logical explanation for what we were seeing. But there was no way this was a person in a costume or some kind of hoax. The way it stood there, so unnaturally still and silent, sent chills down my spine. We sat there frozen for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds or so. Then, ever so slowly, the creature turned its head in our direction. I couldn't make out any clear facial features at that distance, but I swear I felt its eyes lock onto us. In that moment, pure primal terror gripped me. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't even breathe. Suddenly, the creature moved. In one fluid motion, it turned and plunged into the forest behind it. The vegetation shook violently as it crashed through the underbrush, and I could hear the sound of breaking branches echoing across the lake. As soon as it disappeared from view, the spell was broken. Rick and I leapt to our feet, stumbling over each other in our haste to grab our gear and get the hell out of there. We didn't say a word, just threw everything haphazardly into the truck and peeled out of there as fast as we could. It wasn't until we were back on the main road, putting miles between us and that lake, that we finally started to process what had just happened. Rick was the first to speak, his voice shaky. Did we just see Bigfoot? I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I don't know, man. I don't know what the hell that was, but it sure as shit wasn't human. We spent the rest of the drive home trying to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was just a really big black bear that somehow stood up on its hind legs. But we both knew that wasn't true. The proportions were all wrong, and the way it moved, it was just too human-like. When we got back to town, we debated whether or not to report what we'd seen. In the end, we decided against it. Who would believe us? We'd probably just be laughed out of the sheriff's office or accused of being drunk or high. But I couldn't shake the memory of that creature. For weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that massive, fur-covered figure standing at the edge of the lake, its gaze locked onto me. I kept replaying the encounter over and over in my mind, questioning if there was something we could have done differently, some way we could have gotten proof. Rick and I talked about going back to that spot, maybe setting up some trail cameras to see if we could catch the creature on film. But when it came down to it, neither of us could work up the courage. The fear of encountering that thing again was just too strong. As the years went by, the memory of that day never faded. I've told the story to a few close friends and family members, but most people just shake their heads or give me that look like they think I'm crazy. And honestly, sometimes I wonder if I am. If it weren't for Rick being there and seeing the same thing, I might have convinced myself it was all just some vivid hallucination. But deep down, I know what I saw. There's something out there in those woods, something that science can't explain. And while part of me is still curious, still wants answers, a bigger part hopes I never encounter anything like that again. I still go fishing from time to time, but never in that area. And I always make sure to stay close to populated areas, never venturing too deep into the wilderness. Some might call it paranoia, but they weren't there that day. They didn't see what we saw. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself scouring the internet for similar stories. And let me tell you, there are more out there than you might think. People from all over the country who've had encounters just like ours. It's both comforting and terrifying to know we're not alone. I don't know if what we saw that day was really Bigfoot, or some other unknown creature, or something else entirely. But I do know that it changed my perspective on the world. It made me realize that there are things out there beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows of the wilderness. So if you're ever out in the backcountry, fishing or hiking or camping, keep your wits about you. And if you get that feeling of being watched, if the hairs on the back of your neck stand up for no apparent reason, well, maybe it's time to pack up and head back to civilization. Because you never know what might be hiding just out of sight, waiting and watching. As for me, I'll never forget that summer day in 1980. The day I came face to face with the unknown and realized that some mysteries are better left unsolved. The memory of that creature still haunts me, a reminder that the world is a far stranger and more terrifying place than we can imagine. Story 6. I'll never forget that day in 1920 when our peaceful life on the farm was shattered. It was a warm summer evening, and we were all outside enjoying the last bit of daylight. Pa was tinkering with the tractor, my brothers were playing catch, and Ma was hanging laundry on the line. I was sitting on the porch, whittling a stick and daydreaming about nothing in particular. That's when we heard it, a blood-curdling scream coming from the edge of the woods. We all froze, looking at each other in confusion and fear. Pa grabbed his shotgun and started walking towards the tree line, telling us kids to get inside. But before we could move, this thing came bursting out of the forest. I'll never be able to get the image out of my mind. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, and covered in dark, matted fur. The stench hit us even from a distance, like rotting meat and wet dog. Its face was almost human-like but distorted, with a prominent brow and a mouth full of yellowed fangs. Everything happened so fast after that. The creature let out this guttural roar and charged straight for us. Pa fired his shotgun, but it barely slowed the beast down. It swatted Pa aside like he was nothing more than a rag doll. I heard bones crack as he hit the ground. My brothers and I were frozen in terror, but Ma started screaming at us to run. That seemed to draw the creature's attention, and it turned towards her. I've never seen anything move so fast. In the blink of an eye, it had Ma in its grasp, lifting her off the ground. I don't know where I found the courage, but I ran at the monster, swinging the stick I'd been whittling with all my might. It connected with its leg, and to my shock, the creature dropped Ma and turned its attention to me. Those eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. They weren't animal eyes, not really. There was an intelligence there, a malevolence that chilled me to my core. For a moment, we just stared at each other, and I was certain I was about to die. Then my older brother let out a yell and threw a rock, hitting the beast square in the head. It let out a roar of pain and anger, giving me just enough time to scramble backwards. Pa had managed to get to his feet, despite his injuries, and fired another shot. This time, it seemed to have more of an effect. The creature hesitated, looking around at all of us. It was breathing heavily, and I could see blood matting its fur in places. For a moment, I thought it might attack again, but then it turned and loped back into the woods, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. We were all in shock, trying to process what had just happened. Pa was in bad shape. His arm was clearly broken, and his knee was twisted at an unnatural angle. Ma had claw marks down her back, and we were all covered in scrapes and bruises. The next few hours were a blur. Neighbors came running when they heard the commotion, and soon the whole community was in an uproar. The sheriff came out, along with a doctor to tend to our injuries. They searched the woods, but found no sign of the creature beyond some strange tracks and tufts of fur caught on branches. For weeks afterwards, our farm was like an armed camp. Men took turns standing watch through the night, and none of us kids were allowed to play outside alone. The attacks stopped as suddenly as they'd started, but the fear lingered. Even now, decades later, I still wake up in a cold sweat sometimes, the memory of those eyes boring into me. I've heard all the theories over the years: escaped circus animal, undiscovered species, even supernatural explanations. But nothing has ever fully explained what we encountered that day. The incident changed our family forever. Pa was never the same after his injuries, and Ma jumped at every little sound for years. My brothers and I grew up fast, always looking over our shoulders. The carefree days of our youth ended the moment that creature burst from the woods. I know some folks don't believe us, think we made it all up, or exaggerated a bear attack. But I know what I saw. That thing wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered before or since. It moved with a purpose, attacked with an almost human-like intelligence. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is blowing just right, I swear I can still hear that roar echoing through the trees. It makes me wonder if it's still out there, waiting. I've never felt truly safe in the woods since that day, always half expecting to see that hulking shape emerge from the shadows. I don't know if we'll ever have answers about what really happened that summer evening in 1920. But I do know that it changed the course of our lives forever. The physical scars have long since healed, but the mental ones, those never really go away. I've told this story more times than I can count over the years, to disbelieving ears more often than not. But I know what I saw, what we all experienced. That creature was real as the ground beneath our feet. and while I hope to God I never encounter anything like it again, a part of me still wonders what became of it. Did it die from its injuries? Is it still out there, deep in the unexplored wilderness? Or was it truly something not of this world, returning to wherever it came from? I suppose I'll never know for certain. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that day, or the terror we all felt in the face of something we couldn't explain. The attack on our farm may have faded into local legend over the years, but for those of us who lived through it, it remains as vivid and terrifying as the day it happened. It's a reminder that there are still things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows just out of sight. So if you're ever out in the woods and hear something that doesn't sound quite right, or catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, don't dismiss it. You never know what might be watching from just beyond the tree line. Take it from someone who's seen the impossible with their own eyes. There are some things in this world that defy explanation, and it's best to be prepared for anything. Story 7. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural or unexplained. Growing up in rural Pennsylvania, I'd heard my fair share of tall tales and urban legends, but I always brushed them off as nothing more than stories meant to scare kids around a campfire. That all changed one fateful day in the summer of 1891, when I had an encounter that shook me to my very core and made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. It was a sweltering August afternoon, and I had decided to take a solo hiking trip up Summit Mountain to escape the oppressive heat in town. The dense forest provided some relief from the sun, but the air was still thick and humid as I made my way along the overgrown trail. I had been walking for a couple of hours when I started to get an eerie feeling, like I was being watched. The birds had gone quiet, and there was an unnatural stillness in the woods that set my nerves on edge. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself I was just getting spooked by being alone in the wilderness. But then I heard it, a faint, haunting melody drifting through the trees. It sounded almost like a woman's voice, but there was something off about it, something inhuman. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. Against my better judgment, I found myself moving towards the source of the singing. As I got closer, I could make out words, but they were in no language I'd ever heard before. The voice had an otherworldly quality that both attracted and terrified me. My heart was pounding in my chest as I pushed through a thick patch of underbrush, emerging into a small clearing. What I saw there will be forever seared into my memory. Perched high up in an ancient oak tree was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen or imagined. At first glance it appeared to be a woman, but as my eyes adjusted I realized with dawning horror that its entire body was covered in coarse, matted hair. Long, tangled tresses obscured most of its face, but I caught a glimpse of wild, feral eyes peering out from behind the hair. The creature was swaying gently back and forth on its branch, still singing that haunting melody. Its movements were fluid and graceful, almost hypnotic. For a moment I stood frozen, unable to look away from the impossible sight before me. Then the singing abruptly stopped, and those piercing eyes locked directly onto mine. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other. I felt like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a wolf, my body rigid with primal fear. Then the spell was broken as the creature let out an ear-splitting shriek that echoed through the forest. In a blur of movement almost too fast for my eyes to follow, it launched itself from the tree branch and began swinging through the canopy with incredible speed and agility. Panic gripped me, and I turned to run, stumbling over roots and crashing through bushes in my desperation to get away. I could hear it moving through the treetops above me, always just out of sight. Branches snapped and leaves rustled as it pursued me from above. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but sheer terror kept me going. I don't know how long I ran for, but eventually I burst out of the tree line and found myself back on the main trail. I risked a glance over my shoulder, but saw no sign of the creature. The forest behind me was silent once more. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of town, my clothes soaked with sweat and my body trembling from exhaustion and lingering fear. For days afterwards, I was a nervous wreck. I jumped at every sound and refused to go anywhere near the woods. When I finally worked up the courage to tell a few trusted friends what had happened, I was met with skepticism and concern. They tried to convince me I must have imagined it or seen a bear, but I knew what I had witnessed was far stranger than any normal animal. As time passed, I started to hear whispers and rumors from others who had ventured up Summit Mountain. Hikers and hunters spoke in hushed tones of eerie singing on the wind and glimpses of a hair-covered figure swinging through the trees. Some even claimed to have found large, human-like footprints in remote areas of the forest. Each new story sent chills down my spine as I recalled my own terrifying encounter. To this day, I've never been able to fully explain or understand what I saw that summer afternoon. Was it some kind of undiscovered primate, a feral human who had gone wild in the wilderness, or something beyond scientific explanation? I don't have any answers, only the vivid memory of those wild eyes meeting mine and the unearthly song that still sometimes haunts my dreams. I know many will doubt my story or try to explain it away, but I'm sharing it now in the hopes that others who have had similar experiences will feel emboldened to come forward. Something strange lurks in the forests of Burke County, and I believe we've only scratched the surface of understanding what it truly is. All I can say for certain is that my encounter on Summit Mountain changed me forever, opening my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world far beyond our current comprehension. So, if you ever find yourself hiking those remote trails and hear an otherworldly melody drifting on the breeze, my advice is this: turn back immediately. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some creatures are not meant to be seen by human eyes. The wild woman of Summit Mountain may still be out there, watching and waiting in the shadowy canopy. And next time, you may not be lucky enough to escape with just a terrifying story to tell. Story 8. I've never told anyone about this before, but I think it's time I finally share what happened to me back in '88. It still feels surreal, like some kind of fever dream, but I know deep down it was real. It was a crisp fall day in Paris, Texas. I'd taken a few days off work to go hunting in the woods like I did every year. Nothing out of the ordinary, just me, my rifle, and the great outdoors. I'd been out there for hours, trekking through the dense forest, looking for deer. As the day wore on, I started feeling a bit lightheaded. Figured it was just dehydration or something, so I found a nice spot to rest for a bit. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up and it was pitch black. Disoriented, I fumbled around for my flashlight. When I finally got it on, nothing looked familiar. The trees, the underbrush, it was all different. My heart started racing as I realized I had no idea where I was. I checked my watch. I'd been out for hours. How the hell did that happen? I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing made sense. It was like I'd been dropped in a completely different part of the forest. As I stumbled around in the darkness, I started noticing weird things. Broken branches way up high in the trees, massive footprints in the soft earth. At first I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then I saw it. A huge dark shape moving through the trees about 50 yards away. I froze, my blood running cold. It was massive, had to be at least 8 feet tall. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out the outline of what looked like fur. It moved with surprising grace for its size, weaving silently between the trees. I must have made some small sound because suddenly it stopped and turned towards me. I caught a glimpse of glowing eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Its eyes were intelligent, almost human-like. I got the strangest feeling it was assessing me, trying to figure out if I was a threat. Suddenly, two more shapes emerged from the shadows. One was nearly as big as the first, maybe 7 feet tall. The other was smaller, only about 5 feet. A family. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The biggest one, I assumed it was the male, made a series of low grunts and whoops. The others responded with similar noises. They seemed to be communicating. I don't know what came over me, but I lowered my flashlight and slowly raised my empty hands, palms out. I wanted to show I wasn't a threat. The big male cocked its head, studying me. Then, to my utter shock, it started walking towards me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. As it got closer, I could see it more clearly. It was covered in thick, reddish-brown fur. Its face was, well, the only way I can describe it is a mix between human and ape. When it was just a few feet away, it reached out one massive hand. I flinched, thinking this was it. I was about to be torn apart by Bigfoot. But instead, it gently touched my forehead. Its hand was rough and calloused, but the touch was surprisingly gentle. It made a series of soft grunting noises, almost like it was trying to comfort me. Then, to my utter disbelief, it scooped me up like I was a child. I was too shocked to even struggle. It cradled me against its chest and started walking. The other two followed behind as we moved through the forest. I could hear them communicating with more of those grunts and whoops. Despite my terror, I felt strangely safe. It's hard to explain. We traveled for what felt like hours. Eventually we came to a small clearing. There was some kind of crude shelter made of branches and leaves. The big male set me down gently near the entrance. The smaller one, I think it might have been a juvenile, approached cautiously. It seemed curious about me. The female hung back, watching warily. The male made some noises and gestured towards me. The juvenile scampered off into the woods and returned a few minutes later with an armful of berries and what looked like some kind of root. They laid the food in front of me, making encouraging noises. I was starving, but hesitated. What if it was poisonous? The juvenile picked up a berry and ate it, then looked at me expectantly. Slowly, I reached out and took a berry. It was sweet and juicy. I don't know how long I stayed with them. Time seemed to lose all meaning. They brought me food and water, always being gentle and careful. The juvenile seemed fascinated by me, often sitting nearby and watching me intently. At one point, I started shivering. The night air was getting chilly. The big male disappeared into the shelter and returned with what looked like a crude blanket made of woven grass or reeds. It draped it over me awkwardly, but with obvious care. As dawn started to break, the male gently picked me up again. We traveled for a while until we reached the edge of a clearing. In the distance, I could see a road. The male set me down and made a series of soft grunts. It almost sounded like it was saying goodbye. I turned to look at them one last time. The juvenile waved, mimicking a human gesture it must have seen before. Then they melted back into the forest, disappearing like they'd never been there at all. I made my way to the road in a daze. A passing driver picked me up and took me to the nearest town. When I checked a map, I realized I was nearly 10 miles from where I'd started my hunt. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw. Those creatures. They weren't monsters. They were intelligent, caring beings who helped me when I was vulnerable. I think they realized I was sick or hurt and were trying to take care of me. I've spent years trying to make sense of it all. I've read every book, every article I could find on Bigfoot sightings. I'm convinced now that they're real, and that they're not the dangerous beasts some people claim. They're just trying to survive, to be left in peace. I've never gone back to those woods. Part of me wants to try and find them again. But I know it's better to let them be. They showed me kindness and trust. The least I can do is protect their secret. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep at night, I can still feel the gentle touch of that massive hand on my forehead. I can hear those soft, rumbling vocalizations, and I wonder if somewhere out there, they remember me too. Story 9. The moon was full and bright, casting long shadows across the empty road. Cicadas were buzzing loudly in the trees and fields on either side. I wasn't scared being out alone that late. I'd made that walk plenty of times before. Pike County was rural farm country, and not much ever happened around there. As I rounded a bend in the road, I noticed something odd up ahead. At first I thought it was just a shadow, but as I got closer, I realized there was a large, dark figure standing motionless on the shoulder of the road, about 50 yards ahead of me. I slowed my pace, squinting to try and make out what it was in the dim moonlight. My first thought was that it must be a bear, but we didn't really have bears in that part of Missouri. As I cautiously kept walking, I realized this thing was way too tall to be a bear anyway. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, and it was just standing there, perfectly still, facing my direction. A chill ran down my spine as I got close enough to make out more details. This was no animal I'd ever seen before. It had a vaguely human-like shape, but was covered in dark, matted fur. The proportions were all wrong, though. The arms were massively long, hanging down past its knees. The head sat directly on broad, sloping shoulders with no real neck. I froze in my tracks about 20 feet away from this thing. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I could see its eyes reflecting the moonlight, 2 glowing orbs set deep in a heavy brow. They were fixed right on me. I was utterly terrified, but also mesmerized. Some part of my brain was screaming at me to run, but I felt paralyzed. I couldn't look away from those eyes. They seemed almost curious, not aggressive or predatory, just intently observing me. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds or so, the creature slowly turned its massive body away from me. Without a sound, it lumbered off the road and into the dense woods, quickly vanishing into the shadows between the trees. I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to start walking again, picking up my pace. I kept throwing glances over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing emerge from the tree line again. As I power-walked down the road, my mind was racing. What the hell had I just seen? It couldn't have been a person in a costume. The movements were too fluid, too natural. And who would be out here in the middle of nowhere dressed up like that anyway? But it also couldn't have been any known animal. The size alone ruled that out, not to mention the bizarrely human-like features. I was so lost in my thoughts that at first I didn't notice the soft rustling sounds coming from the woods parallel to the road. But then a twig snapped loudly, and I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. I couldn't see anything in the thick foliage, but I just knew that thing was in there, and it was following me. Panic overtook me and I broke into a run. I sprinted down that empty stretch of highway as fast as my legs could carry me. The whole time I could hear something large moving through the woods, keeping pace with me. Branches were snapping and leaves rustling. Every few seconds I'd catch a glimpse of a dark shape moving between the trees. I was sobbing and gasping for air as I ran, but pure adrenaline kept me going. After what felt like miles, but was probably less than one, I finally saw the lights of my family's farmhouse up ahead. I put on a final burst of speed and raced up the long gravel driveway. Just before I reached the porch, I heard an oddly human-like grunt from the edge of our property. I spun around and saw that creature standing at the tree line where our yard met the woods. Even from 50 yards away, I could see its eyes reflecting the porch light as it watched me. I scrambled inside and slammed the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. My parents were asleep, and I didn't want to wake them. I was afraid they'd think I was crazy or on drugs if I tried to explain what happened. So I just huddled in my bed with all the lights on, too terrified to even look out the window. I must have fallen asleep eventually from sheer exhaustion. When I woke up the next morning, it all felt like a surreal dream. But I knew it had been real. I went outside and found huge bare footprints in the soft dirt at the edge of our yard. They were over 15 inches long and deeply pressed into the ground, like whatever made them weighed hundreds of pounds. I never told my parents or anyone else about what I saw that night. Who would believe me? I've spent decades trying to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just my teenage imagination running wild. But deep down, I know what I encountered on that lonely Missouri road. In the years since, I've done a lot of reading about Bigfoot and other cryptid sightings. So many details match up with what I experienced. The height, the inhuman proportions, the curious but non-aggressive behavior. I don't know if what I saw was actually Bigfoot or something else entirely, but I know it was real, and it fundamentally changed how I view the world and what might be out there in the dark woods. I still live in Pike County, though I moved into town years ago. I avoid driving on rural roads at night if I can help it. Whenever I do, I find myself obsessively scanning the tree lines, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching me again. The encounter only lasted a few minutes, but it stayed with me for a lifetime. I'll never forget that summer night when I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. Story 10. I was just a kid back in the summer of '85 when my family decided to go camping at Elk Lake in Oregon. My parents had this old Volkswagen van that we'd load up with all our gear, tents, sleeping bags, coolers full of food. My little sister and I were so excited for our big adventure in the great outdoors. We arrived at the campground in the late afternoon. It was a beautiful spot, surrounded by towering pine trees with the sparkling lake visible through the woods. Dad found us a nice secluded site a bit away from the other campers. We spent the rest of the daylight hours setting up our tents, gathering firewood, and exploring the trails around our campsite. As night fell, we roasted hot dogs and marshmallows over the campfire. Dad told silly ghost stories that had us giggling more than scared. It was a perfect summer evening, crickets chirping, stars twinkling overhead, the smell of pine and wood smoke in the air. We were having such a great time, none of us wanted to go to bed. It must have been close to midnight when we finally crawled into our tents. I shared one with my sister while Mom and Dad were in the other. I fell asleep almost instantly, worn out from all the fresh air and excitement of the day. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up. The fire had burned down to embers, and the campground was pitch black. At first I couldn't figure out what had disturbed me. Then I heard it, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath me. My heart started pounding. I reached over to shake my sister awake, but she was already sitting up, eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she whispered. Before I could answer, we heard it again, louder this time, and closer. Then came a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. It was as if something massive was moving through the forest, snapping tree limbs like twigs. The crashing and splintering noises were deafening in the night air. Whatever it was big, really big. I was frozen in terror, too scared to even cry out. My sister started whimpering softly beside me. Suddenly our tent flap unzipped and Dad's face appeared, pale in the dim light. "Quick, get in the van, now!" he hissed urgently. We scrambled out of our sleeping bags and ran to the VW. Mom was already in the driver's seat, engine running. Dad tossed our sleeping bags in and slammed the sliding door shut behind us. We peeled out of the campsite, gravel flying. As we sped down the dark road, I looked back through the rear window. In the glow of our taillights, I caught a glimpse of something enormous moving in the trees. It was just a shadowy shape, but it seemed to tower over the pines. Then we rounded a curve, and it was gone. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the next town. We ended up getting a motel room and spending the rest of our camping trip at the local pool and arcade. My parents tried to laugh it off, saying we must have heard a bear or something, but I could see the fear in their eyes when they thought we weren't looking. It was years before I learned that other campers had reported strange occurrences in that same area of Elk Lake. Some told of hearing terrifying roars and crashing noises in the night. Others described an eerie silence, as if all the wildlife had suddenly vanished. A few even claimed to have seen massive ape-like creatures moving through the trees. To this day, I don't know what was in those woods that night, but the memory of that sound, that bone-chilling primordial roar, still haunts my dreams sometimes. Whatever it was no ordinary animal, and I'm certain we barely escaped with our lives. I've never been camping since then. Just the thought of being out in the wilderness at night makes my palms sweat. My sister feels the same way. We've talked about it a few times over the years, trying to make sense of what happened. But there are no logical explanations for what we experienced. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has had similar encounters in that area. I've thought about posting online to see if others might corroborate our story, but then I worry people will just think I'm crazy or making it up. So I've kept it to myself all these years. It's hard to convey the sheer terror of that night to someone who wasn't there, the way the ground seemed to shake, the sound of massive trees splintering like matchsticks, that guttural roar that seemed to come from some prehistoric beast. Just writing about it now has my heart racing. I've done some research over the years, read accounts of Bigfoot sightings and strange phenomena in the Pacific Northwest. Some of the descriptions match what we experienced, but I'm still skeptical. It seems impossible that such a creature could exist without definitive proof. And yet, I know what I heard, what I felt, the primal fear that gripped me. That area of Oregon has always had an air of mystery about it. The dense forests, the mist-shrouded mountains. It's beautiful, but there's also something vaguely menacing about the landscape, like nature is hiding ancient secrets. I can understand why legends of hidden creatures persist there. I often wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed in our tents that night. Would whatever was out there have left us alone? Or would we have come face to face with something? The rational part of my brain says it was probably just a bear or elk, but deep down, I know it was something else, something that shouldn't exist in our modern world. The sound of breaking trees still makes me flinch to this day. A few years ago, there was a big storm, and a huge oak fell in our yard. The crack of the trunk splitting sent me into a full-blown panic attack. My wife couldn't understand why I was so shaken up. How could I explain that it brought me right back to that terrifying night in the Oregon wilderness? I've tried to put it behind me, to convince myself it was just an overactive childhood imagination. But then I'll come across a news story about strange sightings in the Pacific Northwest, or I'll have one of those vivid nightmares where I'm back in that tent, listening to that unearthly roar getting closer and closer. And I know it wasn't just a dream or delusion. Something was out there that night, something big and old and angry. I've often thought about going back, trying to find that exact campsite again. Part of me wants answers, wants to prove to myself that there's a logical explanation. But a bigger part of me is still that terrified kid, certain that venturing back into those woods would be suicide. So I stay away and try to forget. But I know I never truly will. Sometimes I wonder if that thing is still out there, roaming the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Do hikers and campers still hear those sounds on dark nights? Has anyone else glimpsed that massive shape moving through the trees? Or was it a one-time encounter with something beyond our understanding? I don't have any answers, just lingering questions and a lifetime of unsettling memories. All I know for certain is that something happened that night at Elk Lake. Something that defies explanation and still sends chills down my spine decades later. I only hope I never encounter anything like it again. Story 11. I was just a teenager back in the late 50s, living in Bell County, Kentucky. My best friend Tommy and I loved exploring the woods and abandoned places around town. We'd always hear stories from the old-timers about strange creatures in the mountains, but we never took them seriously. That all changed one hot summer afternoon. Tommy and I had decided to check out this old coal mine entrance we'd heard about from some kids at school. It was way out in the sticks, probably a good hour's hike from the nearest road. We packed some snacks and drinks and set off early that morning, excited for a day of adventure. The hike was tough going, lots of dense underbrush and steep hills. By the time we finally reached the mine entrance, we were hot, tired, and covered in scratches from thorny vines. But man, was it worth it? The entrance was like something out of a movie, old rotting wooden beams barely holding up the mountain above, rusted metal tracks disappearing into the inky blackness. We stood there for a few minutes, catching our breath and taking it all in. That's when I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a weird-shaped rock or dead tree, but as I looked closer, I realized it was moving slightly. "Hey, Tommy," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the shape. "You see that over there?" Tommy followed my gaze, and I heard his sharp intake of breath. "What the hell is that?" he hissed. As our eyes adjusted to the shadows, I felt my heart start racing. Standing there, right next to the mine entrance, was something. It was huge, had to be at least 8 or 9 feet tall. Its body was covered in matted white-grayish fur. But the thing that really got me was how human-like it looked, standing on 2 legs with its arm casually draped over one of the support beams. For a second, I thought maybe it was just some weirdo in a costume. But then it turned its head and looked right at us. Those eyes. They were too intelligent, too aware. This was no costume. This was something else entirely. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But I was frozen in place, unable to look away from those piercing eyes. It felt like hours passed as we all just stared at each other, though it was probably only a few seconds. Suddenly, Tommy grabbed my arm. "We gotta go," he said, voice shaking. "Now!" That broke the spell. We turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the thorns tearing at our clothes and skin. I kept expecting to hear heavy footsteps behind us, to feel a massive hand grab me. But there was nothing, just the sound of our own ragged breathing and pounding hearts. We didn't stop running until we hit the road. Doubled over and gasping for air, we looked at each other with wide eyes. Did you see that?" Tommy wheezed. I nodded, still unable to catch my breath enough to speak. "We gotta tell someone," Tommy said. "My uncle works for the sheriff's department. He'll know what to do." I wasn't so sure. Who would believe 2 teenagers claiming they saw some kind of giant ape man in the woods? But I was too shaken up to argue, so I just nodded again. We made our way to Tommy's uncle's house and spilled out the whole story. To his credit, he listened patiently and didn't immediately dismiss us as crazy. He called up a couple of his deputy buddies, and they agreed to go check it out. The ride back out to the mine was tense. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, questioning if I had really seen what I thought I saw. Maybe it was just a bear standing up? But no, it was way too tall for a bear, and the way it moved was all wrong. When we finally reached the spot, my heart was in my throat. Part of me was terrified we'd find the creature again, but another part desperately wanted proof that we weren't going crazy. We approached the mine entrance cautiously, the deputies with their hands on their holsters. But there was nothing there. No tracks, no fur, no sign that anything had ever been there at all. The adults searched the area for a good hour, but came up empty. I could tell they were starting to get annoyed, probably thinking we had sent them on a wild goose chase. Tommy's uncle tried to be nice about it, saying maybe we had just seen a shadow, and our imaginations ran wild. But I could see the doubt in his eyes. On the ride home, Tommy and I didn't say much. What was there to say? We knew what we saw, but we had no way to prove it. For weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those intelligent, almost human-like eyes staring back at me. I kept expecting to see the creature again, peering in my bedroom window or lurking at the edge of the woods. But as time passed and nothing happened, the memory started to fade. Tommy and I never really talked about it again. It was like this unspoken agreement. We both knew what we saw, but rehashing it wouldn't change anything. We drifted apart after high school, as childhood friends often do. But even now, all these years later, I still think about that day sometimes. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and always wondered if that's what we encountered. But it doesn't quite fit. This thing was much paler than the typical Bigfoot description. I've never been able to explain what we saw that day. Was it some undiscovered species? A government experiment gone wrong? Or just two overactive teenage imaginations? I don't know. But I do know that it changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that defy our understanding of what's real. I've never gone back to that mine. Part of me wants to see if I can find any trace of the creature, to prove to myself once and for all that it wasn't just a dream or hallucination. But a bigger part of me is scared. Scared of what I might find, or what might find me. So I keep the memory locked away, only pulling it out on nights when the wind howls through the trees and the shadows seem to move of their own accord. On those nights, I lie awake and wonder, is it still out there, watching and waiting? And if it is, what does it want? I don't expect I'll ever have answers to these questions, but I know one thing for certain. I'll never forget those eyes, that impossible creature, and the day my understanding of the world changed forever. Story 12. It was a hot June day, and I remember the cicadas were buzzing like crazy as I made my way out to check on the livestock. Everything seemed normal at first. The cows were grazing peacefully, chickens pecking around the yard. But as I got closer to the barn, I noticed something was off. It was too quiet. Usually you could hear McKinney's dogs barking and carrying on, but there wasn't a peep. I called out for them, but got no response. That's when I saw it. Dark streaks on the ground leading into the barn. My stomach dropped as I realized it was blood, lots of it. With shaking hands, I pushed open the barn door, and the smell hit me like a punch to the gut. That sickly sweet copper scent of fresh blood. Inside, it looked like a slaughterhouse. The dogs were, I can barely bring myself to describe it, torn apart, like something with incredible strength had just ripped them to shreds. I stumbled back outside, trying not to vomit. What the hell could have done this? That's when I heard McKinney shouting from the cattle pasture. I ran over and found him standing by the fence, white as a sheet. One of his prized calves was dead, its body dragged about 15 feet outside the fence. The poor thing's throat had been torn out, and there were deep claw marks all over it. But the really chilling part was the hair we found all around the fence and on the calf's body. Coarse black hair, almost like a bear's, but different somehow. And there were massive footprints in the mud, bigger than any man's, with what looked like claw marks at the toes. McKinney was in shock, muttering about how the fence was electrified and there's no way anything could have gotten through without getting zapped. Whatever did this somehow disabled the electric fence too. We called the sheriff, but I could tell he didn't believe us when we tried to explain what we'd found. He wrote it off as a bear attack, even though there hadn't been bears in that part of Kentucky for decades. That night, I couldn't sleep a wink. Every little sound outside had me on edge. I kept replaying the gruesome scene in my mind, trying to make sense of it. What kind of creature could overpower two big farm dogs and a calf? And those footprints, they were huge, but distinctly bipedal. The next morning, McKinney and I went out at first light to check the rest of the property. That's when we saw it. At the edge of the woods, watching us. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, covered in shaggy black fur. But the face, God, the face. It was like a twisted parody of a human face, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with an otherworldly intelligence. For a moment, we all just stood there, frozen. Then McKinney yelled and ran for his truck. The thing let out this bone-chilling howl and loped off into the woods with incredible speed. I've never run so fast in my life as I did back to the farmhouse. We got the sheriff out there again, but of course the creature was long gone. He clearly thought we were hysterical or pulling some kind of hoax. But I know what I saw. That was no bear, no wild animal. It walked on 2 legs, had hands with opposable thumbs. But it wasn't human either. Over the next few days, we found more evidence around the farm. Strange tracks, tufts of that coarse black hair caught on fences. One morning, we found all the chickens dead in the coop, their necks snapped. But not eaten, just killed for seemingly no reason. The final straw came about a week after the first attack. I was out in the far pasture fixing a section of fence when I got that feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowly turned around. There it was again, standing at the tree line about 50 yards away. In broad daylight this time. I could see it clearly now. It was huge, its muscular body covered in matted black fur. The head was large and somewhat pointed, sitting directly on broad shoulders with hardly any neck. But those eyes, they bored into me with an intelligence that seemed beyond animal. For a moment I thought I saw something almost sad in its gaze. Then it took a step towards me and I ran. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, not daring to look back. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, getting closer. Just as I reached the barn, I heard a strange sound, almost like words, but garbled and guttural. Then silence. When I finally worked up the courage to look, it was gone. But there in the dirt were those massive footprints and a tuft of black hair caught on the fence. That was my last day working at McKinney's farm. I quit on the spot and moved into town. McKinney himself sold the property not long after and moved away. Nobody would believe our story. They all assumed it was just a bear or a wild dog pack. But I know what I saw. To this day I can't explain what that creature was or why it was there. Some kind of undiscovered primate? An escaped lab experiment? I don't know. But I do know that it was intelligent, it was powerful, and it was definitely not supposed to exist. I still have nightmares about those eyes, that almost human face. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I can hear that eerie howl echoing in the distance. I've never gone camping or hiking since then. Hell, I get nervous just being in my own backyard after dark. I don't expect anyone to believe me. But I know what I saw that summer in Trimble County. And I know that there are things out there in the woods that defy explanation. Things that maybe we're not meant to understand. All I can say is, if you're ever out in those Kentucky hills and you get that feeling of being watched, don't ignore it. And whatever you do, don't look back. Story 13. It all started on a humid evening in early July. I was playing in the backyard with our dog Rusty when I first heard it, a long, low howl echoing across the fields behind our house. At first I thought it might be a coyote or maybe a neighbor's dog, but something about the sound made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was deeper and more guttural than any animal I'd ever heard before. I called Rusty over to me, suddenly not wanting to be alone out there as dusk settled in. He came trotting over, but his ears were pricked up, and he kept looking towards the sound with his hackles raised. That's when I knew something wasn't right. Rusty was the bravest dog I knew, and I'd never seen him spooked like that before. I hurried inside and told my parents about the strange howl. They brushed it off at first, saying it was probably just some animal passing through the area. But over the next few nights, the howls continued and grew closer. Soon the whole neighborhood was on edge. I remember lying awake in bed, covers pulled up to my chin, straining my ears to catch any sound from outside. The worst part was the waiting, knowing that eerie howl could pierce the night at any moment. When it did come, it seemed to go on forever, rising and falling in pitch. Sometimes it sounded almost human, but distorted and wrong somehow. Other times it was more like a roar that shook the windows. My little sister would come running into my room crying whenever we heard it. I tried to act brave for her sake, but inside I was terrified too. Our parents started keeping us indoors after dark, and all the neighborhood kids traded wild theories at the bus stop about what could be making those sounds. Old Mr. Johnson from down the street swore it was a pack of wolves that had migrated up from the south. Mrs. Abernathy thought it might be some kind of government experiment gone wrong. My best friend Tommy was convinced it was aliens, but deep down, we all knew it was something else, something that shouldn't exist. About a week after the howls started, other strange things began happening around the neighborhood. The Wilsons woke up one morning to find huge, deep claw marks gouged into the side of their barn. The Millers' garbage cans were found crushed and mangled in their driveway. Pets started going missing, first small animals like cats and rabbits, then even some of the bigger dogs. My dad and some of the other men in the neighborhood started organizing patrols at night, armed with rifles and flashlights. I begged to go along, but they wouldn't let me. I'd peek out my bedroom window and see them walking up and down the street, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. But they never found anything. The police came out a few times to investigate, but they seemed just as baffled as everyone else. I overheard one officer telling my dad they'd never dealt with anything like this before. They set up some motion-activated cameras near the flood levee where a lot of the sounds seemed to be coming from, but the footage always came back blank or too blurry to make anything out. As the days went by, the atmosphere in our little community grew more and more tense. People spoke in hushed voices and hurried from their cars to their houses. No one lingered outside after sunset. The usual summer sounds of kids playing and neighbors chatting were replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by those bone-chilling howls. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Friday, and my parents had reluctantly agreed to let me sleep over at Tommy's house. His parents were out of town, so his older brother was watching us. We stayed up late watching monster movies on TV, trying to pretend we weren't scared of the real monster lurking outside. Around midnight, the power suddenly went out. Tommy's brother went to check the fuse box, leaving us alone in the pitch-black living room. That's when we heard it. Heavy footsteps on the back porch, followed by a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the whole house. Tommy and I huddled together on the couch, too terrified to move or make a sound. The back door creaked open slowly. In the faint moonlight coming through the window, I caught a glimpse of something massive filling the doorway. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur, with glowing red eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I wanted to scream, but my voice was frozen in my throat. The creature took a step into the room, its claws clicking on the hardwood floor. The smell that hit us was overpowering, like wet dog mixed with rotting meat. Just then, Tommy's brother came running back into the room with a flashlight. The beam caught the monster full in the face, and it let out a deafening roar that shook the windows. In that split second of illumination, I saw its face clearly, a mix of ape and wolf, with huge fangs protruding from its snarling mouth. It lunged forward, knocking over furniture, as Tommy's brother fired his dad's shotgun. The blast was deafening in the small room. The creature stumbled back, howling in pain and rage. It crashed back out through the door and disappeared into the night. The next few hours were a blur of police sirens, frightened neighbors, and my frantic parents coming to get me. No one could quite believe our story at first, but the destroyed living room and claw marks on the porch were undeniable evidence that something had been there. Over the next few days, police and wildlife officials swarmed the area. They found massive footprints near the levee and tufts of coarse hair caught on tree branches. But despite an extensive search, they never found the creature itself. The official explanation was that it must have been some kind of escaped exotic animal, maybe a bear or large ape. But those of us who saw it that night knew the truth. It was something much stranger and more terrifying than that. The howls stopped after that night, and life in our neighborhood slowly returned to normal. But things were never quite the same. We all looked at the woods differently, jumping at shadows and strange sounds. Many families, including ours, ended up moving away within the next year. To this day, I still have nightmares about those glowing red eyes and that horrifying roar. I've researched similar incidents over the years and come across terms like Bigfoot and Sasquatch, but nothing I've read quite matches what we experienced that summer. Whatever it was that terrorized our community back in 1971, I hope I never encounter anything like it again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some creatures better left hidden in the darkest corners of the wilderness. But I'll never forget the summer when something straight out of a nightmare came to life in our quiet Kentucky neighborhood. Story 14. I'd been walking through the woods for hours, my feet aching in my old boots. As the sun started to set, I decided to head back to my Jeep. That's when I noticed the soybean field up ahead. I figured I'd cut through it as a shortcut. The beans were tall, coming up to my chest. I could barely see over them as I trudged along. The crickets were chirping loudly, and an owl hooted in the distance. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. But then I heard it, a deep, guttural growl unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I froze in my tracks, my heart pounding. My mind raced, trying to identify the sound. A bear? No, we didn't have bears in this part of Kentucky. A mountain lion, maybe? But it sounded bigger, much bigger. That's when I saw it. About 20 yards ahead of me, the beans started rustling violently. Something massive was moving through the field, heading straight for me. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so bad I could barely grip it. Before I could turn it on, the creature emerged from the beans. Even in the dim twilight, I could make out its massive silhouette. It was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging down almost to its knees. The body was thick and muscular, easily 500 pounds or more. I stood there, paralyzed with fear. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered before. Not human, not animal, something in between. The creature turned its head towards me, and I saw 2 glowing eyes reflect in the fading light. They were intelligent eyes, aware. That's when I knew this was no ordinary animal. I wanted to run, to scream, to do something, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was frozen in place, unable to move a muscle. The creature took a step towards me, and I could hear its heavy breathing. That's when my survival instincts finally kicked in. I dropped my rifle and ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, crashing through the beans, not caring about the direction. All I knew was I had to get away from that thing. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground. The sound of beans being crushed and uprooted filled my ears. It was gaining on me. Somehow, I made it to the edge of the field. I burst out onto the dirt road where I'd parked my Jeep. I fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before I finally got the door open. I jumped in and slammed the door shut, locking it immediately. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that massive shape emerge from the field at any second. Finally, the engine roared to life. I stomped on the gas, the tires spinning in the dirt before finding traction. As I sped away, I saw movement in my mirror. Something large and dark stepped out onto the road, watching me drive away. I didn't slow down until I reached the main highway. My heart was still racing, and I was drenched in sweat. I pulled over to the side of the road and sat there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What was that thing? It was too big to be a man, too intelligent to be an animal. The way it moved, the way it looked at me, it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. I debated whether to report it to the police, but who would believe me? They'd think I was drunk or crazy. So I kept it to myself, only telling my closest friends and family over the years. But I never went hunting in Logan County again. In fact, I gave up hunting altogether after that night. The thought of being alone in the woods, vulnerable to whatever that creature was, it was too much for me to handle. For years afterwards, I had nightmares about that encounter. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the image of those glowing eyes seared into my brain. Even now, decades later, I still get chills when I think about it. I've read about similar sightings over the years, people describing giant ape-like creatures in the woods. Some call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I don't know what to call it, but I know what I saw that night was real. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, roaming the forests of Kentucky. Part of me hopes it is, that such an incredible creature could exist without being discovered. But another part of me hopes it was just a one-time thing, a freak encounter that will never be repeated. I've never been able to explain what happened that night. Was it some unknown species, a government experiment gone wrong, or something even more mysterious? I don't have the answers, and I'm not sure I want them. All I know is that night changed me forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows, just out of sight. To this day, I can't look at a soybean field without feeling a sense of dread. The sound of rustling leaves makes my heart race. And on quiet nights, when the wind is still and the crickets are chirping, I sometimes think I hear that deep, guttural growl in the distance. I don't expect anyone to believe my story. Hell, there are days I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw that night in Logan County. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget the night I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. So if you're ever out in the woods of Kentucky and you hear something moving in the bushes, something big, don't stick around to find out what it is. Run. Run as fast as you can, because you never know what might be lurking in the shadows, watching and waiting. As for me, I'll stick to the safety of my home. I've had my fill of adventure, and I've seen things that no man was meant to see. That night in 1972 was enough to last me a lifetime. Whatever that creature was, wherever it came from, I hope it stays in the depths of the forest where it belongs. Because if it ever decides to venture out into the world of men, God help us all. Story 15. I'll never forget that day in Boyd County back in '75. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and I was driving down a lonely stretch of road, surrounded by dense forest on both sides. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the landscape in vibrant shades of red and gold. I had the windows down, enjoying the cool breeze and the earthy scent of fallen leaves. As I rounded a bend, something caught my eye at the edge of the tree line. At first, I thought it was just a bear, or maybe a large dog. But as I got closer, I realized it was something I'd never seen before. This creature was standing upright on two legs like a person, but it was covered in dark, matted fur from head to toe. It must have been at least 6 feet tall, probably taller. My hands started shaking on the steering wheel as I slowly approached. I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered. The creature turned and looked right at me as I drove past. That's when I saw its face clearly, and my blood ran cold. It had an elongated snout, almost like a wolf, but the eyes, they were disturbingly intelligent, alert, not animal eyes at all. They bored into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, and when its mouth opened slightly, I caught a glimpse of razor-sharp teeth. Time seemed to slow to a crawl in that moment. I felt like I was moving through molasses, everything happening in slow motion. The air grew thick and heavy. My ears started ringing. It was the strangest sensation I've ever experienced. I must have only been looking at it for a few seconds as I drove by, but it felt like minutes, hours even. I couldn't look away from those piercing eyes. They seemed to stare straight through me, into my very soul. As soon as I passed it, I slammed on the gas pedal. My heart was racing, hands trembling so bad I could barely keep hold of the wheel. I kept checking the rearview mirror, terrified I'd see it chasing after my car. But it just stood there at the edge of the road, watching me drive away. I didn't slow down or stop until I got home. I ran inside and locked all the doors, drawing the curtains closed. For days afterwards I was jumpy and on edge. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It was too tall and muscular to be a person in a costume. The way it moved was fluid and natural, and those eyes, they haunted my dreams. I've heard stories about Bigfoot sightings, but this was different. It wasn't just some hairy ape man. The face was canine, predatory, like some kind of werewolf. I know how crazy that sounds. I almost didn't want to tell anyone for fear they'd think I was losing my mind, but I know what I saw. It was real, and the way time seemed to warp and slow down. I can't explain it. It was like that creature's presence somehow distorted reality itself. I avoided driving on that road for months afterwards. Even now, years later, I get chills thinking about it. I've never seen anything like it again, but I know it's out there, waiting, watching from the shadows of the forest. Sometimes at night, I'll wake up in a cold sweat, those predatory eyes vivid in my mind. The memory of that day is seared into my brain. The dark fur, the wolfish snout, the glint of sharp teeth, and always those eyes, filled with an alien intelligence. I've tried to rationalize it over the years, tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks, a bear standing on its hind legs maybe, but deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk at the edges of our reality. That creature was real, and encountering it changed me forever. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings after that, always scanning the tree line when I drove. I started carrying a camera with me everywhere, hoping to capture proof if I ever saw it again. But in all the years since, I've never had another sighting. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I'll catch a glimpse of movement in the woods out of the corner of my eye, or hear an eerie howl carried on the wind late at night, and I know it's still out there, waiting. I've done research over the years, trying to find similar accounts. There are stories of dogmen and werewolf sightings scattered across the country, but nothing quite matches what I saw that day. The time distortion is what really gets me. How do you explain that? It was like that creature's very presence warped the fabric of reality, like it didn't fully belong in our world. I've thought about reporting it to authorities or researchers, but who would believe me? And part of me is afraid of what might happen if I drew attention to it. What if it came looking for me? So I've kept quiet all these years, carried this secret, but it weighs on me. The need to tell someone, to try to understand what happened that day. I still drive through Boyd County sometimes, and every time I find myself scanning the tree line, hoping for another glimpse, but also dreading it. What if I saw it again? What would I do? The rational part of my brain says it was just an oddly shaped bear, a trick of the light and an overactive imagination. But in my heart, I know the truth. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, creatures that lurk in the shadows, defying explanation. I don't know what that being was. Bigfoot, werewolf, some unknown cryptid. I can't say for certain, but I know it was real, and the memory of those eyes still haunts me to this day. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen it. If there are others out there carrying this same secret, afraid to speak up for fear of ridicule. Maybe someday the truth will come out. Maybe there's a whole hidden world of creatures we don't understand. All I know is that my encounter that day changed me forever. It opened my eyes to possibilities I'd never considered, made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. I still get goosebumps every time I drive past that spot on the road. My hands get clammy on the steering wheel. I find myself holding my breath, half expecting to see that dark shape emerge from the trees. But it never does, and somehow that almost makes it worse. The not knowing, the constant vigilance, always wondering if it's out there, watching, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever have answers, if I'll ever understand what I saw that day. But I know it was real, and I'll carry that memory, those piercing, intelligent eyes, with me for the rest of my life. So, if you're ever driving through the back roads of Boyd County, keep your eyes on the tree line. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows. And if you see something you can't explain, well, now you know you're not alone. Story 16. I'll never forget that summer day in 1976. It was supposed to be just another lazy afternoon exploring the woods behind our house in Clark County, but it turned into something that would haunt my dreams for years to come. I was 10 years old at the time, right in the middle of our sibling group of 5. There was Johnny, the oldest, at 12, then me, Amy at 8, Billy at 6, and little Susie, who had just turned 4. Our parents were busy with chores that day and told us to go play outside, so we decided to venture into the familiar woods we'd explored 100 times before. It was late July, hot and humid as Kentucky summers always are. The cicadas were buzzing loudly, and the air felt thick and heavy as we traipsed through the underbrush. We were following a faint trail that led down to the small creek where we liked to catch crawdads and minnows. Everything seemed normal at first. Johnny was in the lead as usual, with me right behind. The younger ones trailed after us, giggling and chattering away. But as we got deeper into the woods, I started to get an uneasy feeling. The birds had gone quiet, and there was a strange stillness in the air. I was about to mention it to Johnny when suddenly Billy let out a blood-curdling scream. We all whirled around to see him pointing frantically at something in the trees. "Monster!" he shrieked. "Big, hairy monster!" My heart nearly stopped as I followed his gaze. There, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, was a massive, hair-covered figure. It was at least 7 or 8 feet tall, with long arms that hung down past its knees. The face was hidden in shadow, but I caught a glimpse of gleaming eyes watching us. For a split second, we all stood frozen in terror. Then Johnny snapped into action, yelling for us to run. I scooped up little Susie, and we all took off back up the trail as fast as we could. I could hear heavy footsteps crashing through the woods behind us, but I didn't dare look back. We burst out of the tree line into our backyard, gasping for breath. Our parents came running out of the house, alarmed by our screaming. We tried to explain what had happened between sobs and hyperventilating. "There's a monster in the woods," Billy kept insisting. "It was big and hairy and scary." Our parents exchanged concerned looks, clearly not believing us. Dad went to check the woods, but of course found nothing. They tried to calm us down, saying it was probably just a bear or our imaginations running wild. But we knew what we saw. It was no bear, and it certainly wasn't our imagination. That night, Billy drew a picture of the creature. It showed a huge, ape-like being covered in shaggy hair, with long arms and a vaguely human face. Looking at that crayon drawing sent chills down my spine all over again. The next day, against our parents' wishes, Johnny and I snuck back down to the creek to look for evidence. We found several large bare footprints in the mud near the water. They were easily twice the size of our dad's feet, with 5 distinct toes. Whatever had made those prints was no normal animal. We tried to show our parents, but by then the prints had been washed away by the creek. They continued to dismiss our story as an overactive imagination, but us kids knew the truth. We had seen something that day in the woods, something that wasn't supposed to exist. For weeks afterward, I had terrible nightmares about the creature. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I could hear heavy breathing outside my window. My siblings were similarly affected. Little Susie refused to go outside for the rest of the summer. Billy would burst into tears at the slightest strange noise. We never saw the hairy monster again after that day, but the memory of that encounter has stayed with me all these years. Sometimes I try to rationalize it. Maybe it really was just a bear, and our young minds blew it out of proportion. But then I remember those inhuman footprints, and the way the thing moved with an eerie intelligence as it watched us from the trees. To this day, I get goosebumps when I think about what we saw in those Kentucky woods. I've read about other Bigfoot sightings over the years, and I can't help but wonder if that's what we encountered that summer day. Whatever it was, it opened my eyes to the fact that there are things in this world that defy explanation. I've never been able to look at the woods the same way since then. Even now, decades later, I find myself scanning the tree line whenever I'm in a forest, half expecting to see that hulking, hair-covered shape watching me from the shadows. That summer day in 1976 shattered my sense of what was real and possible, leaving me with questions that I fear will never be fully answered. My siblings and I have talked about it many times over the years, trying to make sense of what happened. Johnny insists it must have been someone in a costume playing a sick prank, but I'm not so sure. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, it felt too real, too alive to be a hoax. Amy thinks it might have been some kind of undiscovered primate species, like a remnant population of Gigantopithecus that somehow survived in the remote forests. It's a comforting theory, but it doesn't fully explain the almost supernatural dread we all felt in its presence. Billy still has night terrors about it sometimes. He wakes up screaming about the forest monster coming to get him. It breaks my heart to see how deeply that encounter affected him, even all these years later. As for little Susie, she claims to have no memory of that day at all. But I've noticed she refuses to go camping or hiking and gets visibly anxious around densely wooded areas. Some part of her still remembers, even if she won't admit it. I've spent countless hours researching cryptozoology and Bigfoot sightings, looking for some explanation of what we experienced. I've even gone on a few expeditions with Bigfoot hunter groups, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature. But I've never seen anything like what we saw that day. Sometimes I wonder if we somehow slipped into another reality for a brief moment, a parallel world where these creatures exist openly. It would explain why we never saw it again, and why no concrete evidence has ever been found. But that idea is almost more terrifying than the creature itself. All I know for certain is that something happened in those woods that defied everything I thought I knew about the world. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things out there beyond our understanding, creatures that lurk in the shadows of our reality. I still live in Kentucky, not far from where we grew up. Sometimes I drive out to those woods and just sit at the edge of the tree line, staring into the depths of the forest. Part of me hopes to see the creature again, to prove to myself once and for all that it was real. But another part of me dreads the idea of coming face to face with that primal fear once more. Whatever it was we saw that day, the memory of it has shaped my entire life. It taught me that the world is stranger and more mysterious than we can imagine. And it left me with a deep respect for the unknown, for the things that exist just beyond the edge of our perception. I may never know for sure what that creature was or why it appeared to us that day. But I know what I saw, what we all saw, and no amount of skepticism or rational explanations can erase the memory of those gleaming eyes watching us from the shadows of the Kentucky woods. Story 17. I was just a kid back in the fall of 1978, living on our family farm in Henry County, Kentucky. It was a quiet, rural area, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and nothing too exciting ever happened. At least, that's what I thought, until that crisp October evening when my whole world turned upside down. My older brother Tom and I were out doing our evening chores, feeding the animals and shutting up the barn for the night. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields. There was a chill in the air that made me pull my jacket tighter around me. As we finished up in the barn, Tom suddenly froze, his eyes fixed on something outside. "Hey, do you see that?" he whispered urgently. I peered out the barn door, following his gaze. At first I didn't notice anything unusual, just the fence line at the edge of our property, bordering the dense woods beyond. But then I saw it. There was something massive standing next to one of the fence posts. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It was some kind of creature, but unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. It was enormous. The fence post barely came up to its knees, and it was covered in dark, shaggy fur from head to toe. "What is that thing?" I hissed to Tom, my voice shaking. He shook his head slowly, eyes wide. "I don't know," he murmured, "but it's not like any animal I've ever seen." We stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe as we watched the creature. It was eerily still for several long moments. Then it began to move. Despite its massive size, the thing moved with a fluid grace that sent chills down my spine. It took long, smooth strides, covering ground quickly without seeming to exert much effort. There was something almost human-like about its gait, but distorted and unnatural. As it neared the tree line, I expected to hear the crash of branches or rustle of leaves, but the creature slipped into the woods without making a sound, as if it was gliding rather than walking. In a matter of seconds, it had vanished completely into the gathering darkness. Tom and I stood in stunned silence for several minutes, straining our eyes and ears for any sign of the beast, but there was nothing, no movement, no sound. It was as if it had never been there at all. Finally, Tom grabbed my arm. "Come on," he said urgently. "We need to tell Mom and Dad." We ran back to the house, tripping over our own feet in our haste. We burst through the door, babbling over each other as we tried to explain what we'd seen. Our parents exchanged worried glances as we described the huge, furry creature. Dad got his rifle and went out to check around the property, but found no sign of anything unusual. Mum tried to calm us down, suggesting it was probably just a bear. But I knew what we'd seen wasn't any ordinary animal. The size alone was impossible. It had to be at least 8 or 9 feet tall, and the way it moved, I'd never seen anything like it. That night I lay awake for hours, jumping at every little sound. I kept picturing that massive silhouette, imagining it lurking just outside my window. Even after I finally dozed off, my dreams were filled with visions of shaggy fur and inhuman eyes watching me from the shadows. The next day, Dad went around to the neighboring farms to ask if anyone else had seen anything strange. A couple people mentioned hearing weird noises at night recently, but no one had seen the creature Tom and I described. We went back out to the spot by the fence where we'd seen it, searching for any evidence, but there were no giant footprints, no broken branches, nothing to prove what we'd witnessed. If it weren't for the vivid image burned into my mind, I might have started to believe I'd imagined the whole thing. As the days passed with no further sightings, life gradually returned to normal. But things were never quite the same for me after that. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, always scanning the tree line when I was outside. For months, I refused to go near the barn alone, especially as it got dark. Tom and I talked about it sometimes, rehashing every detail of what we'd seen. We scoured books and newspapers for any similar reports, but never found anything that quite matched our experience. It wasn't until years later that I first heard the term Bigfoot and realized it fit the description of what we'd encountered that night. By then, of course, no one really believed our story anymore. Even Tom had started to doubt his own memory of events. But I know what I saw. That creature was real, as unbelievable as it seems. To this day, I can picture it with perfect clarity. The massive, fur-covered body, the fluid, almost graceful movement, the way it vanished into the woods without a trace. I've never seen anything like it since, despite spending plenty of time in those same woods over the years. But I've always wondered, was that a one-time occurrence? Or is that creature, or others like it, still out there somewhere watching from the shadows? I don't have any answers. All I know is that my encounter that autumn evening changed my perspective on the world forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things out there beyond our understanding, things that defy explanation. Sometimes when I'm out in nature, especially as twilight approaches, I'll get a prickle on the back of my neck, a sense that I'm being watched. In those moments, I'm transported back to that night in 1978, and I wonder, is it out there? Will I ever see it again? Part of me hopes I do, just to validate what I experienced all those years ago. But another part of me dreads the idea. Because if that creature is real, what else might be lurking in the unexplored corners of our world? I've carried this story with me for over 40 years now. I've told it to my own kids, though I'm not sure they really believe it. Most people don't, and I can't blame them. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I probably wouldn't believe it either. But I know what I saw that night, and no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget the mixture of awe and terror I felt as I watched that massive, impossible creature slip silently into the woods, leaving no trace behind. So I guess I'm sharing this now as a reminder to keep an open mind, to remember that there's still so much we don't understand about the world around us, and to always keep your eyes open, because you never know what incredible, terrifying things you might encounter when you least expect it. Story 18. We had just finished bringing in the last of the corn crop the day before, and Dad wanted to walk the fields to make sure we hadn't missed anything. As we made our way across the freshly harvested field, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just an oddly shaped hole or depression in the dirt, but as we got closer, I realized it was a footprint, and not just any footprint. This thing was massive. "Dad, look at this!" I called out, pointing to the strange impression in the soil. He came over, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What in the world?" he muttered as he crouched down to examine it more closely. The print was easily twice the size of my dad's work boot. You could clearly make out the shape of toes and a heel, but it looked nothing like a human foot. The stride between prints was huge, too, much longer than even my dad could take in a single step. A chill ran down my spine as we followed the tracks across the field. They seemed to come from the woods on the north side of our property, cross diagonally through the cornfield, and then disappear into the tree line on the far side. "Should we call the sheriff?" I asked nervously. My dad nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I reckon we better. Never seen anything like this in all my years of farming." We hurried back to the house, and Dad got on the phone with the sheriff's office. Within an hour, 2 deputy cars came rolling up our long gravel driveway, kicking up dust. I'll never forget the look on Deputy Wilson's face when we showed him those tracks. His eyes went wide, and he let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "In all my years on the force, I ain't never seen prints like these." They took photos and measurements, carefully documenting everything. Word spread fast in our small farming community. By that afternoon, half the town seemed to have shown up to gawk at the mysterious footprints. Theories started flying around. Some folks thought it must be some kind of hoax or prank. Others whispered about government experiments gone wrong. But there were a few old-timers who spoke in hushed tones about legends of a giant, ape-like creature said to roam the forests of North America. That night, I barely slept a wink. Every creak of the old farmhouse made me jump. I kept imagining some massive beast lurking just outside my window. The next morning, bleary-eyed from lack of sleep, I went with Dad to check on the livestock. As we approached the chicken coop, my heart nearly stopped. The wire fencing had been ripped open, and there were more of those huge footprints in the mud. Inside, it was a gruesome scene. Half our chickens were gone, the rest torn to pieces. Dad's face went ashen. "Go back to the house and call the sheriff again," he said grimly, and grabbed my shotgun from the closet. The next few days were a blur of police, reporters, and curiosity seekers. The story made headlines in papers across the state. "Monster footprints found on Iowa farm," one blared. Experts were brought in to examine the prints. They confirmed what we already knew. These weren't from any known animal. The police set up patrols around our property, but whatever had made those tracks seemed to have vanished. We repaired the chicken coop and kept all the animals locked up tight at night. Dad took to sitting up late with his shotgun across his lap, watching the tree line. For weeks, the whole county was on edge. Parents wouldn't let their kids play outside after dark. Farmers brought their livestock in close to the barns at night. You couldn't go anywhere without hearing people talking about the Humboldt monster. But as the days turned to weeks with no further sightings, things slowly began to calm down. The police patrols became less frequent. People started to rationalize what had happened, coming up with explanations that were easier to swallow than some unknown beast. Yet I knew what I had seen. Those footprints were burned into my memory. Sometimes at night I'd wake up in a cold sweat, certain I'd heard heavy footsteps outside my window. Even now, all these years later, I can't explain what happened that fall. Was it some undiscovered creature, a horrific prank gone too far, or something else entirely? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. But I do know this. I've never looked at those woods the same way since, and on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the corn, I still find myself straining to hear, listening for the heavy footfalls of something that should not exist. The incident changed our community in ways that are hard to describe. For months afterward, there was a palpable tension in the air. People who had never locked their doors before suddenly became cautious. Hunters reported strange noises in the woods, and more than a few came back early from their trips, spooked by something they couldn't quite explain. I remember overhearing hushed conversations at the general store, old-timers recounting tales passed down through generations of strange creatures glimpsed in the forests. Stories that had once seemed like nothing more than campfire tales suddenly took on a new, chilling significance. The scientific community got involved too. A team from the state university came out to study the tracks before they were weathered away. They took plaster casts and soil samples, measured and photographed everything. But in the end, their report was frustratingly inconclusive. The prints were real, they said, but they couldn't definitively say what had made them. For a while, our farm became something of a tourist attraction. People would drive by slowly, hoping to catch a glimpse of the monster. Some even tried to sneak onto the property at night. Dad had to put up no trespassing signs and started patrolling the perimeter with his old hunting dogs. The media attention was overwhelming. Reporters camped out at the end of our driveway for days, hoping for an interview or a new development. I remember one particularly persistent journalist who tried to convince me to take him into the woods where the tracks had led. I refused, of course. Something in my gut told me it wasn't safe. As winter set in, the frenzy began to die down. The fields were bare, covered in a light dusting of snow that would have shown any new tracks clearly, but there were none. Whatever had visited us that fall seemed to have moved on, but the effects lingered. I noticed my parents whispering more, giving each other worried looks when they thought I wasn't paying attention. Dad installed extra locks on all the doors and windows. Mom started insisting that I be home before dark, no matter what. For me, the hardest part was the nightmares. Night after night, I'd dream of being chased through endless cornfields by some unseen monster. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, certain that I'd heard something moving outside my window. School was tough too. Some kids thought it was cool that this had happened on our farm, but others teased me mercilessly. They'd make monster noises when I walked by, or leave crude drawings of Bigfoot in my locker. It got so bad that I started dreading going to school each day. As the years passed, the incident faded into local legend. It became one of those stories that old-timers would tell at the diner, embellishing a little more each time. To most people, it was just another weird tale like crop circles or UFO sightings. But for those of us who were there, who saw those massive footprints with our own eyes, it was something we could never fully shake. It changed the way we saw the world, made us question what we thought we knew about the natural order of things. Even now, decades later, I find myself scanning the tree line when I visit my old hometown. Part of me hopes to catch a glimpse of whatever it was that visited our farm that fall. Another part of me prays I never do. I've read all the theories over the years. Bigfoot, alien, government experiment gone wrong. You name it, someone's proposed it. But none of them quite fit what we experienced. The truth is, we may never know what really happened in Humboldt County in the fall of 1977. All I know is that it was real. Those footprints were real. The fear was real. And somewhere out there, maybe that creature is still roaming, leaving behind nothing but questions and a lingering sense of unease in those who cross its path. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind rustles through the cornfields, I find myself listening for heavy footsteps, for the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. And I wonder, will it ever return? And if it does, will we be ready for it this time? The incident in Humboldt County may have faded from the headlines, but for those of us who lived through it, it remains a vivid reminder that there are still mysteries in this world. That sometimes the line between legend and reality can blur in the most unexpected and terrifying ways. And so, I continue to watch, to listen, to remember. Because some things once seen can never be unseen, and some mysteries once encountered will haunt you for the rest of your days. Story 19. I was just a young man back in '77, working my family's farm in Mahaska County, Iowa. It was a quiet life, tending to the crops and livestock day in and day out. But everything changed that summer when those things started showing up. It began innocently enough. I'd noticed some of our chickens going missing, figured it was probably coyotes or foxes. So I started leaving out some scraps, old vegetables, stale bread, that sort of thing, hoping to lure whatever was taking them so I could deal with it. But what came wasn't any normal predator. The first time I saw one, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dim evening light. It was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur, built like a man, but not quite right. The proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, hunched over slightly. And the face. God, that face. Like a cross between an ape and a man, with deep-set eyes that reflected the porch light. I blinked, and it was gone, melting back into the shadows at the edge of the cornfield. I told myself I must have imagined it, been working too hard in the sun. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. After that first sighting, I started paying closer attention, left out more food, stayed up late watching from the window, and sure enough, they came back. Not just one, but several. The big one I'd first seen, and a couple smaller ones, maybe 4 or 5 feet tall. They'd creep out of the corn under cover of darkness, snatch up whatever food I'd left, and disappear again in seconds. I tried telling my wife about it, but she just looked at me like I was crazy, said I needed to lay off the moonshine. But I knew I wasn't drunk, and I wasn't imagining things. These creatures were real, and they were coming to my farm night after night. For weeks this went on. I'd leave out food, watch them take it, try to get a better look. But they were always too quick, too wary. As soon as I'd open a door or window for a clearer view, they'd vanish. Then came that night in late August. The air was thick and heavy, a storm brewing on the horizon. I'd put out a bigger spread than usual, some steak trimmings, old fruit, even a half-empty bottle of whiskey. Figured maybe if I got them drunk, I could finally get a good look. I settled in by the window with my shotgun across my lap, determined to stay awake all night if I had to. Hours ticked by, nothing but the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. Then, just as I was starting to nod off, movement caught my eye. There they were, 3 of them this time, the big one and 2 smaller ones. They crept up to the food, sniffing cautiously. The smaller ones started grabbing handfuls, shoving meat and fruit into their mouths. But the big one, it just stood there, staring right at the house, right at me. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure they must be able to hear it. Slowly, carefully, I raised the shotgun. Just wanted to scare them off, get a reaction. Show them I wasn't gonna tolerate this invasion of my property any longer. I aimed at the sky and squeezed the trigger. The blast shattered the night, echoing across the fields. The smaller creatures bolted instantly, faster than anything I've ever seen move. But the big one, it didn't even flinch. For a long moment, we just stared at each other through the glass. Those eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. There was intelligence there, and something else. Something ancient and wild. Then it moved. Faster than should have been possible for something that size. 1 second it was by the food, the next it was right at the window. I scrambled backwards, tripping over my own feet in my haste to get away. But I wasn't fast enough. A hairy arm smashed through the glass like it was tissue paper. I felt strong fingers wrap around my throat, cutting off my air. The stench that poured in was overwhelming. Wet fur and rotting meat and something I can't even describe. I clawed at the hand crushing my windpipe, tried to bring the shotgun up, but it was no use. The strength in that grip was inhuman. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision as I fought for breath. The last thing I remember is that face pressed against the broken window, those eyes boring into mine, filled with an anger and intelligence that chilled me to my core. Then everything went dark. I came to who knows how long later, sprawled on the floor amid broken glass and splintered wood. My throat felt like it was on fire, every breath painful. But I was alive. Stumbling to my feet, I grabbed the shotgun and staggered outside, half expecting to see the creatures still there. But the yard was empty, food scattered across the ground. The only sign anything had happened was my old pickup truck. The windshield was completely shattered, caved in like something massive had brought both fists down on it. claw marks scored deep into the hood and doors. It looked like it had been mauled by a grizzly bear. I sank to my knees in the damp grass, shotgun slipping from numb fingers. What the hell had I gotten myself into? These weren't animals, weren't anything I could explain, and I'd made them angry. The rest of that night is a blur. I remember my wife finding me out there as the sun came up, asking what happened. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could I make her understand when I barely understood it myself? In the light of day, it all seemed impossible. If it wasn't for my battered throat, the wrecked truck, I might have convinced myself it was just a nightmare. But the evidence was there, undeniable. I cleaned up as best I could, made up some story about vandals to explain the damage. Knew no one would believe the truth. Hell, I barely believed it myself. For weeks after, I barely slept. Jumped at every sound, every shadow. Kept the gun close, doors locked tight. But they never came back. Whatever I'd done by shooting at them, it seemed to have driven them away for good. Life gradually returned to normal, or as normal as it could be. I never told anyone the full story of what happened. Who'd believe me? Sometimes I almost managed to convince myself I'd imagined it all, dreamed up those creatures in some fever dream. But even now, all these years later, I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat. The memory of those eyes, that inhuman strength, as fresh as if it happened yesterday. And I wonder, are they still out there, watching, waiting? I don't leave food out anymore. But sometimes on quiet nights, I swear I can hear something moving in the corn, and I know deep in my bones that they're still out there, and that next time I might not be so lucky. Story 20. We were sitting on the porch after dinner when we first heard it, a deep, guttural howl echoing from the direction of the river. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, not a coyote or a fox or even a bear. This was something different, primal. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "What was that?" my brother whispered, his eyes wide. I shook my head, listening intently. For a few moments, all was silent. Then we heard it again, closer this time. A low, rumbling growl followed by heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. Grandpa came out onto the porch, shotgun in hand. "Boys, get inside," he said firmly. We didn't need to be told twice. As we hurried into the house, I caught a glimpse of something large moving at the edge of the cornfield. In the dim light from the porch, I could just make out a massive, shadowy figure. It had to be at least 7 feet tall. My heart was pounding as we huddled inside with Grandma. Grandpa stayed out on the porch, keeping watch. Every few minutes we'd hear another howl or the sound of something large moving through the fields. It went on for hours, circling the property, but never coming too close to the house. Eventually, things quieted down as dawn approached. We barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. In the light of day, Grandpa went to investigate. He found huge, bare footprints in the mud by the river and broken corn stalks where something big had pushed through the field. We weren't the only ones who experienced something strange that night. Over the next few days, stories started circulating around town. Old Man Johnson, who lived a few miles down the road, said he saw a huge, hairy creature standing under the light in his barnyard. Said it was at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur, with glowing eyes that reflected the light. A trucker passing through on Route 6 reported seeing a similar creature in his headlights. Said it loped across the road on 2 legs, moving faster than any man could run. He was so shaken up he had to pull over for a while to calm his nerves. Then there was Tom Baker, who lived out by himself in a cabin near the river. He came into town wild-eyed and babbling about a monster that had broken into his shed. Said he woke up to the sound of metal clanging and wood splintering. When he went to investigate, he saw an enormous ape-like creature ransacking the place. It tore the door clean off its hinges. Tom fired a warning shot with his rifle, and the thing took off into the woods, but not before turning to look right at him. He said its eyes gleamed with an unnatural intelligence, that it wasn't just some animal, but something more. For weeks, the whole county was on edge. More sightings trickled in, always at night, always near the river or the surrounding woods. Some folks claimed to have found strange tracks or tufts of coarse hair caught on fences. The local paper ran a front-page story speculating about a Dallas County Bigfoot. My brother and I begged to go back to the farm to investigate, but our parents wouldn't hear of it. Looking back now, I'm grateful for that. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something to be trifled with. As suddenly as the sightings began, they tapered off. By mid-December, things had quieted down. Some said the creature must have moved on to a new territory. Others insisted it had all been an elaborate hoax or mass hysteria. A few diehards formed a local Bigfoot research group, but they never turned up any conclusive evidence. To this day, I'm not sure what to make of what happened that fall. I know what I heard, what I glimpsed in the darkness. The raw fear I felt was real enough. But could there really be some unknown creature lurking in the Iowa woods? It seems impossible. And yet, sometimes when I'm back home visiting family, I'll find myself staring out at those dark fields and forests, wondering, listening for that bone-chilling howl. Part of me hopes I'll never hear it again, but another part almost wishes I would. Just to know, once and for all, that I wasn't imagining things, that there really are still mysteries out there in the world, waiting to be discovered. I've never told many people about what happened. Who would believe it? But that November changed me, made me look at the world differently, made me question what I thought I knew about reality and the creatures we share this planet with. Whatever it was that stalked the banks of the Raccoon River in the fall of '78, the memory of it has stayed with me all these years. A reminder that there are things out there beyond our understanding, things that defy explanation. And sometimes, just sometimes, they venture close enough for us to catch a glimpse of them in the darkness. Story 21. Until that night. I was sound asleep when I was jolted awake by the frantic barking of our dogs outside. At first I tried to ignore it, figuring they had just spotted a raccoon or something. But the barking grew more intense and agitated. I had never heard them sound so worked up before. I got out of bed and went to my window, which looked out over our backyard towards the swampy area beyond. In the dim moonlight I could see our 3 dogs, 2 German shepherds and a Labrador, running back and forth along the edge of the swamp, barking their heads off at something in the cattails and reeds. That's when I heard it, a deep, rumbling growl unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It sent chills down my spine. This was no ordinary animal. I ran to my parents' room and shook my mum awake. "Mom, there's something out there. The dogs are going crazy." She got up groggily and followed me to the window. We stood there watching the dogs, straining our eyes to see what had them so riled up. Suddenly, there was a loud splashing sound from the swamp. The reeds parted, and we saw a massive dark shape move through the water. It was huge, way bigger than a person or any animal that should have been in our swamp. My mum gasped. "What on earth is that?" The dogs charged at the creature, snarling and snapping, but every time they got close, there was a loud whump sound, and they went flying backwards like they'd been hit by a truck. Whatever this thing was, it was incredibly strong. We could hear it moving through the swamp, the water churning as it went. The dogs kept chasing after it, only to get knocked back again and again. Their barks were becoming more frantic and fearful now. My dad woke up from all the commotion. "What the hell is going on out there?" he demanded as he joined us at the window. "There's something in the swamp," I said, my voice shaking. "Something big." Dad grabbed his rifle from the closet. "I'm going out there to check it out. You two stay inside." "No!" Mom cried, grabbing his arm. "It's too dangerous. Look what it's doing to the dogs." As if to emphasize her point, we heard another loud whomp and a yelp of pain as one of the dogs went flying. Dad hesitated, clearly torn between protecting us and investigating. In the end, he decided to stay put. We huddled by the window, watching helplessly as this bizarre scene unfolded in our backyard. The splashing and crashing through the swamp continued for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20-30 minutes. The dogs kept up their relentless pursuit, only to be batted away again and again by this unseen force. At one point, the creature seemed to be moving closer to our house. We could hear its heavy footsteps and labored breathing. It sounded enormous. I remember clutching my mom's arm, terrified that it was going to come bursting out of the swamp and attack us. But then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The splashing noises faded into the distance. The dogs' barking became less frantic and more confused. Eventually they came slinking back to the house, tails between their legs. We waited another hour, listening intently. But there was nothing. Just the normal nighttime sounds of crickets and frogs. When dawn broke, Dad and I went out to investigate. The swamp was a mess. Reeds and cattails flattened, huge gouges in the mud. But there were no clear footprints, nothing we could definitively identify. The dogs were battered and bruised, but thankfully not seriously injured. They were uncharacteristically skittish for days afterwards, refusing to go near the swamp. We never did figure out what happened that night. Dad reported it to the local sheriff, but they just chalked it up to an unusually aggressive bear, even though bears aren't native to our area. Some of our neighbors shared similar stories of weird noises and disturbances from the swamp over the years. There were whispered theories about escaped zoo animals or government experiments. A few even mentioned Bigfoot. Personally, I don't know what to believe. I've replayed that night in my head countless times over the years, trying to make sense of it. All I know for certain is that there was something in our swamp that night. Something big, strong, and terrifying. Something that defied explanation. To this day, I get chills when I hear a dog barking at night. Part of me is always afraid I'll look out the window and see that dark shape moving through the shadows again. I don't live on that farm anymore. My parents sold it a few years after the incident and moved into town. But sometimes I drive by the old place and look out at that swamp, and I wonder, is it still out there? Story 22. We had our camper set up near the boat dock, and I remember being excited to go fishing with my dad the next morning. As night fell, we sat around the campfire roasting marshmallows and telling stories. It was a clear night with a bright moon, and the river lapped gently at the shore nearby. Everything seemed so peaceful. Around 10 p.m., my mom said she was tired and headed into the camper to sleep. My dad and I stayed up a bit longer, but soon decided to turn in as well. I crawled into my sleeping bag in the camper's small bedroom area, while my parents took the fold-out bed in the main living space. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when I was jolted awake by a loud, guttural roar coming from outside. At first, in my groggy state, I thought it might be a bear. But as I became more alert, I realized it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was a deep, resonant sound, almost like a lion's roar, but with a weird trumpeting quality to it, like an elephant. The sound sent chills down my spine. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding. "Dad?" I called out nervously. I heard my parents stirring in the other room. "I hear it too, Jackie," my dad said, his voice tense. "Stay inside. I'm going to take a look." "Dave, don't go out there," my mom hissed. But my dad was already pulling on his boots and grabbing his flashlight. I crept to the small window by my bed and peered out into the moonlit night. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then a massive dark shape moved near the boat dock about 50 yards away. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. It looked vaguely like a person, but much too big and bulky. As it shifted, I could see it was covered in thick, matted hair. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. It was some kind of creature, not a bear or any other animal I recognized. It was bipedal, standing on two legs like a person, but it was huge. Even from this distance, I could tell it was at least 7 or 8 feet tall. Its arms hung long at its sides, swinging as it moved. Just then, my dad stepped out of the camper, flashlight beam sweeping the area. The creature's head snapped towards the light. I saw 2 eyes reflect back, glowing an eerie yellowish green in the beam. A primal fear gripped me as I realized those eyes were fixed right on my dad. The thing let out another of those bone-chilling roars. It was so loud it seemed to vibrate the whole camper. Then it started lumbering towards us with surprising speed for its size. "Dave, get back inside now," my mom screamed. But my dad seemed frozen in shock, flashlight beam still trained on the approaching monster. I was paralyzed with terror, unable to look away as this nightmarish beast bore down on our campsite. As it got closer, I could make out more details. Its face was a twisted, ape-like visage with a pronounced brow and a wide, lipless mouth. Stringy hair hung down over its massive shoulders and chest. The smell hit me then, an awful, musky odor like wet dog and rotting vegetation. My dad finally snapped out of his daze and scrambled back towards the camper door. But before he could reach it, the creature was upon us. With one swipe of its enormous arm, it struck the side of our camper. The whole vehicle rocked violently. I was thrown from my bed, landing in a heap on the floor. I heard my mom scream as the beast pounded on the camper again and again. Metal creaked and groaned under the assault. I was sure the walls would cave in at any moment. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. I heard heavy, snuffling breaths right outside the window by my head. Slowly, terrified of what I'd see, I raised my eyes to look out. A massive, hairy face filled the entire window, yellowish eyes peering in intently. I could see strings of drool hanging from yellowed fangs. The creature's hot breath fogged up the glass as it stared right at me. I was paralyzed, unable to move or even breathe as I locked eyes with this impossible monster. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, the face disappeared from view. I heard more snuffling and grunting sounds as the thing circled our camper, still trying to find a way in. "Dave, do something!" my mom cried out. I heard my dad fumbling around, then the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being cocked. "Get away from us, you son of a bitch!" he yelled. The creature roared again in response, the sound so loud and close it made my ears ring. There was another tremendous impact against the camper, nearly tipping it over this time. Boom! The shotgun blast was deafening in the confined space. I heard the creature bellow, more in rage than pain it seemed. There was a moment of tense silence, then the sound of splashing water. Cautiously, I peeked out the window again. In the moonlight, I could just make out a dark shape moving through the water, swimming powerfully downstream. Within moments, it had vanished into the darkness. We sat in stunned silence for several minutes, hardly daring to breathe. Finally, my dad spoke up. Is everyone okay?" My mom and I managed weak affirmatives. Slowly, hesitantly, my dad opened the camper door and stepped outside, shotgun still at the ready. After a few moments, he called back that the coast seemed clear. We spent the rest of that night huddled together in the camper, jumping at every little sound. None of us slept a wink. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, we packed up and got the hell out of there. On the drive home, we tried to process what had happened. My dad estimated the creature had been around 8 feet tall and easily 400 pounds, far bigger than any man. We all agreed on the ape-like features and the bizarre roaring sound it made. My mom swore she saw it walking on 2 legs like a person. "It had to have been a bear," my dad said. But he didn't sound convinced. We all knew bears don't walk upright like that, or have such human-like features. When we got home, my parents made me promise not to tell anyone what had happened. They were afraid people would think we were crazy. For years I kept that promise, carrying the secret of that terrifying night. But I've never forgotten it, and I've always wondered what exactly we encountered that night in Boone County. Was it some kind of unknown primate? A creature from folklore come to life? I don't have any answers, but I know what I saw. And sometimes on dark nights, I still hear that unearthly roar in my dreams. Story 23. It was a chilly autumn night, must have been around 9 p.m. I was in the living room watching TV when I heard this god-awful racket coming from outside. At first I thought it was just the wind kicking up, but then I heard Rusty squawking like crazy. I grabbed my shotgun and flashlight and headed out to investigate. The moment I stepped onto the back porch, I knew something wasn't right. There was this smell in the air, kinda musky and wild, like wet dog mixed with something I can't even describe. I swept my flashlight beam across the yard, and that's when I saw it. Standing there by the chicken coop was the biggest, strangest creature I've ever laid eyes on. Had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. It was covered in shaggy white fur from head to toe. But this wasn't no polar bear or anything like that. It was standing upright on 2 legs, built like a man, but way bigger and broader. For a split second, we just stared at each other. Its eyes caught the light and glowed this eerie yellowish color. I was frozen in place, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then everything happened so fast. The thing reached down and snatched up Rusty like he was nothing more than a rag doll. Poor bird was flapping and shrieking. Before I could even think to raise my gun, the creature hurled Rusty with incredible force. That rooster sailed through the air and slammed into the side of the house with a sickening thud. That's what snapped me out of my daze. I brought the shotgun up to my shoulder and fired, but the thing was already on the move. It loped across the yard on those long legs, faster than anything that size should be able to move. I got off one more shot as it vaulted over our fence, but I'm pretty sure I missed. By the time I ran to the fence, the creature had vanished into the woods beyond our property. All I could hear was the sound of branches snapping as it crashed through the underbrush, getting fainter by the second. I stood there for I don't know how long, heart pounding, straining my ears for any sign of the thing coming back. Eventually I became aware of my wife calling my name from the porch. She'd heard the gunshots and was worried sick. I hurried back to reassure her, though I was far from calm myself. We found Rusty's body by the house. His neck was broken from the impact. I'll never forget the look on Tommy's face when we had to tell him what happened to his beloved pet. How do you explain something like that to a child when you can't even explain it to yourself? The next day, I scoured the yard and the edge of the woods for any trace of the creature. There were a few odd prints in the mud near the chicken coop, huge bare footprints, almost human-like but way too big. They disappeared once they hit the leaf litter, though. I reported it to the sheriff's office, but they didn't take it too seriously. Figured it was just a bear, even though we rarely get them around here. A few deputies came out and poked around, but they didn't find anything conclusive. Word got around town pretty quick. Most folks thought I was pulling their leg or had one too many beers that night. A couple of the old-timers, though, they got real quiet when I described what I saw. One of them muttered something about that derned Ohio grassman, but wouldn't elaborate. I've racked my brain trying to come up with a rational explanation for what I saw that night. Could it have been a man in some kind of costume? Maybe. But the way it moved, the raw power when it threw Rusty, that was no person in a suit. A bear. The closest match in some ways, but bears don't stand and walk on 2 legs like that, and they sure as hell don't have glowing eyes. For weeks afterwards, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, imagining I heard heavy footsteps outside or caught a whiff of that musky odor. I took to sleeping with my shotgun propped against the nightstand. My wife thought I was losing it, and honestly, sometimes I wondered if I was. We never saw the creature again, but things were never quite the same after that night. I found myself scanning the tree line whenever I was outside, especially at dusk. We got rid of the chickens. I told the family it was because they were too much work, but really I was afraid of attracting that thing back to our property. Tommy had nightmares for months. He'd wake up crying, saying the big white monster was going to get him. It broke my heart that I couldn't protect him from this, couldn't even properly explain what had happened. As the years went by, the memory of that night faded somewhat, but it never fully left me. I've heard stories since then of other sightings in the area, folks glimpsing a large, white, ape-like creature in the woods or on lonely back roads. Some call it Bigfoot, others have different names for it. I don't know what to call it, I just know what I saw. I'm an old man now, and I've seen a lot in my life. But nothing compares to those few terrifying moments in my backyard on that October night in 1980. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are days I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw, and I'll carry that memory with me to my grave. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is blowing just right, I could swear I catch a hint of that strange, musky scent on the breeze. And for a moment, I'm right back there, staring into those glowing yellow eyes, wondering what other mysteries are hiding in the dark woods of Kentucky. Story 24. I had just gotten home from my shift at the lumber yard and was looking forward to a quiet night in. As I approached my trailer, something felt off right away. The door was slightly ajar, which I knew for certain I hadn't left that way. My heart started racing as I cautiously pushed it open, fearing a burglar might be inside. What I found was far worse than any human intruder. The interior of my trailer was in complete disarray. Furniture overturned, cabinets flung open, my belongings strewn everywhere. But it was the kitchen that really made my blood run cold. The refrigerator door was wide open, food scattered all over the floor. And my freezer. Dear God, my freezer. It had been completely ransacked, barely any food left inside. As I stood there in shock, trying to process the scene before me, that's when I noticed the smell. There was a pungent, musky odor permeating the air that I'd never encountered before. It was animalistic, but not like any animal I knew. This was something different, something wild and primordial. With trembling hands, I grabbed my flashlight and began searching for clues. That's when I saw them, enormous footprints tracked through the mess on my kitchen floor. My mind reeled as I followed their path. These weren't human footprints, nor any kind of animal print I recognized. They were massive, easily 14 inches long, with strange toe patterns. I stumbled backwards, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. What in God's name could have left prints like that? As the realization hit me that some sort of creature had invaded my home, panic overtook me. I raced outside, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever had been in there. Once outside, I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, my entire body shaking. The beam caught something that made my heart stop, a flash of movement in the shadows, something large ducking behind a tree. I caught only a glimpse, but it was enough to see that this was no ordinary animal. The sheer size of it. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. I ran to my truck as fast as my legs would carry me and peeled out of there, gravel flying. I drove straight to the sheriff's office, barely able to form coherent sentences as I tried to explain what had happened. They must have thought I was crazy or drunk, but they agreed to send some deputies out to investigate. When we returned to my trailer, the deputies were clearly skeptical at first, but as soon as they saw the destruction inside and those massive footprints, their demeanor changed completely. They'd never seen anything like it. They took pictures, collected samples, and spent hours combing the area for signs of the creature. As they searched, one of the deputies made a chilling discovery that still haunts me to this day. Caught on a branch near where I'd seen movement was a tuft of coarse white hair, unlike anything native to our area. The color drained from the deputy's face as he bagged it as evidence. Despite their best efforts, they weren't able to track the creature. The trail went cold at the edge of the woods. Whatever it was, it had vanished back into the wilderness, leaving us with far more questions than answers. In the days and weeks that followed, my life became a nightmare. I couldn't bring myself to stay in that trailer, constantly fearing the creature's return. I moved in with my sister temporarily, but even there I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every noise in the night made me jump. Every shadow seemed to conceal some hulking form. The incident made the local papers, of course. "Bigfoot breaks into man's home," the headlines blared. I hated the attention, the skepticism, the barely concealed mockery from some. But I knew what I had seen. This was no bear or other known animal. The sheer size of those footprints, that white hair, the way it moved, this was something else entirely. I became obsessed with researching similar encounters, desperate to make sense of what had happened to me. I discovered that while rare, there had been other sightings of large, ape-like creatures in the Appalachian region over the years. Some even described white-haired variants. Had one of these legendary creatures been responsible for invading my home? As the weeks turned to months, the physical evidence collected that night was inconclusive. The hair samples were deemed unidentified primate, but without a creature to compare them to, they couldn't say more. The plaster casts of the footprints remain one of the largest on record for alleged Bigfoot prints. To this day, I still struggle with the impact of that night. I've never felt truly safe in the woods since then. Every camping trip, every hike is tinged with an undercurrent of fear. I'm always scanning the trees, listening for heavy footsteps or that distinctive musky odor. I've faced my share of skeptics and ridicule over the years. People love to dismiss it as a hoax or a bear encounter. But I know what I experienced. The pure terror of realizing some unknown creature had invaded my home, the glimpse of that massive form in the woods. Those things can't be explained away. Sometimes I wonder if it was drawn by the smell of food in my freezer. Had I inadvertently lured this creature to my home? Was it just a hungry animal looking for an easy meal? Or was there some deeper intelligence behind its actions? The questions gnaw at me, even all these years later. I've heard theories that these creatures, if they exist, are some sort of relict hominid or undiscovered primate. Others claim they have paranormal origins. I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that something terrifying and inexplicable happened to me that night in 1980, something that defies conventional explanation. I still live in Kentucky, though I moved to a more populated area after the incident. But every October, as the leaves start to turn and that familiar chill enters the air, I'm transported back to that night. I find myself lying awake, straining to hear any unusual sounds outside my window. And I wonder, is it still out there? Will I ever truly understand what happened? Some nights, I dream of those footprints. In my nightmares, I'm following their trail deeper and deeper into the dark woods. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, just as I'm about to come face to face with the creature. Other times, the dreams are peaceful, almost like the creature is trying to communicate something to me. But I always wake up with that same feeling of unresolved mystery. I've been told I should write a book about my experience, but I've never felt comfortable with that level of attention. This is the first time I've really shared the full story publicly. I'm not looking to convince anyone or prove anything. I just needed to finally get this off my chest, to share my truth with others who might understand. To this day, I have no concrete explanation for what happened that night. Was it truly a Bigfoot or some unknown creature? Was it an elaborate hoax, despite the lack of any clear motive? Or is there some other explanation that my mind simply can't comprehend? I may never know for certain, but I know what I saw, what I smelled, what I felt, and those memories will stay with me for the rest of my life, a constant reminder that there are still mysteries in this world that defy our understanding. Story 25. I was just 17 years old in November 1983, living in a small town in Franklin County, Kentucky. My friends and I loved exploring the backwoods and going on little adventures, especially during deer hunting season when we'd go out scouting for good spots. That fateful day started out like any other. Me, my buddy Tom, and our friend Mike decided to check out this logging road we'd heard about from Mike's older brother. It was a crisp fall afternoon as we piled into Tom's beat-up pickup truck and headed out of town. The trees were ablaze with red and gold leaves, and there was that earthy smell of decaying foliage in the air. We were in high spirits, laughing and joking around as Tom navigated the winding country roads. After about 30 minutes of driving, we turned onto a narrow dirt road that cut through dense forest. The trees pressed in close on both sides, branches scraping against the truck. It was noticeably darker and quieter under the thick canopy. An uneasy feeling started to creep over me, but I brushed it off. We drove for another 15 minutes or so before the road became too rough for the truck. Tom pulled over in a small clearing and we hopped out, deciding to continue on foot. Mike had brought his dad's old rifle, just in case we see a deer, though we knew hunting season hadn't officially started yet. As we hiked deeper into the woods, following the overgrown logging road, an eerie silence settled over everything. No birds chirping, no squirrels rustling in the leaves, just the crunch of our boots and our own hushed voices. The hairs on the back of my neck started to stand up. Something felt off. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when we came around a bend and stopped dead in our tracks. About 50 yards ahead of us was a huge bull just standing motionless in the middle of the road. It was the biggest bull I'd ever seen. Must have weighed close to a ton. But the strange thing was how still it was. Didn't even seem to be breathing. As we stood there gawking, movement caught my eye to the left of the bull. I'll never forget what I saw next as long as I live. Emerging from the trees was the largest, most terrifying creature I've ever laid eyes on. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, covered in shaggy brown fur. The body was massively muscular, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. But it was the face that haunts my nightmares to this day. It had a sloped forehead and a protruding jaw, almost ape-like, but not quite. The eyes were deep-set and glinted with an unnatural intelligence. As it lumbered towards the bull, I could see its huge clawed hands. We were frozen in terror, barely daring to breathe. The creature stopped next to the bull, which still hadn't moved a muscle. It was like the animal was in some kind of trance. The beast reached out one massive hand and gently stroked the bull's flank. A low, rumbling sound came from its throat, not quite a growl, almost like purring. Suddenly, a twig snapped under Tom's foot. The creature's head whipped around, those piercing eyes locking right onto us. In that moment, I felt a wave of primordial terror wash over me. Every instinct screamed at me to run. Mike let out a strangled yelp, and that broke the spell. We turned and sprinted back the way we'd come, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, branches snapping. The sounds seemed to be getting closer. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Lungs burning, legs pumping, I didn't dare look back. All I could think was that I had to get away, had to reach the truck. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we finally burst out of the woods into the clearing where we'd parked. We piled into the truck, screaming at Tom to go, go, go. He fumbled with the keys, engine finally roaring to life. We peeled out of there, spraying gravel. As we tore down the logging road, I finally worked up the courage to look out the rear window. I almost wished I hadn't. There, at the edge of the clearing, I caught a glimpse of a massive fur-covered form. It was just standing there, watching us go. Then we rounded a bend, and it was lost from view. We drove in terrified silence for a while, all of us too shocked to speak. Finally, Mike broke the silence. What the hell was that thing? None of us had an answer. We swore a pact right then and there to never speak of what we'd seen. Who would believe us anyway? I've spent the past 40 years trying to rationalize what happened that day. Maybe it was just a bear. Maybe we were all caught up in some mass hallucination. But deep down, I know what I saw. That creature was no bear, no known animal. The intelligence in those eyes, it still makes me shudder to think about. I've never gone back to those woods, never told anyone but my wife about what happened. But I still have nightmares sometimes, of massive fur-covered forms, glinting eyes in the darkness, and that low, rumbling purr. Whatever that thing was, it was not of this world, and I pray to God I never encounter anything like it again.